also if you can expand. Wow.
Yes. And the paywall is not particularly useful here, because the core argument of the paper is accessible through the abstract, related publications, and the author's subsequent work. I can give you a fairly detailed reconstruction of the argument without pretending to have read text that isn't available. The paper you're referring to is Donald Hoffman, Manish Singh, and Chetan Prakash, The Interface Theory of Perception, published in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review in 2015. The interesting part is that the theory has two different levels, and people often mash them together. One, a relatively conventional evolutionary claim: perception evolved to guide adaptive behavior, not necessarily to represent the world accurately. Two, a much more radical philosophical ontological claim: the things we perceive, including space, time, and physical objects, may be an interface rather than representations of the underlying structure of reality. The first claim is considerably easier to defend than the second. That distinction matters enormously. Number one, the basic idea: imagine opening your computer. You see a blue folder, a trash can icon, a file, a cursor. The actual computer does not contain tiny blue folders sitting inside it. There are electrical states, voltages, transistors, electromagnetic interactions, memory addresses, etc. Yet the folder icon is extremely useful. When you drag the folder into the trash, you don't need to know anything about the underlying electrical architecture. The interface hides it. And crucially, open quote, the icon doesn't need to resemble what it represents, close quote. A folder icon doesn't look anything like the physical structure of the data stored on your SSD. Hoffman's proposal is that perception works more like this than like a camera. Image. When you look at an apple, your experience contains red plus round plus solid plus located over there's edible object. But Hoffman says you should not automatically infer, open quote, there is an objectively existing red round solid thing out there whose properties resemble my experience, close quote. Instead, open quote, my perceptual system generates an icon called apple because that representation is useful for controlling behavior, close quote. That is a much stronger claim than ordinary perceptual science usually makes. Number two, why evolution enters the argument. This is where Hoffman tries to get mathematical rather than merely philosophical. The conventional intuition is something like, open quote, organisms that perceive the world accurately should be better at surviving, close quote. If there's a tiger, seeing an accurate tiger is useful. If there's food, accurately seeing the food is useful. Therefore, natural selection should gradually produce increasingly accurate perception. It sounds almost trivially obvious. Hoffman says, not necessarily. Natural selection doesn't directly reward truth. It rewards fitness, and those aren't the same thing. Suppose two organisms encounter some complicated environment. Organism A. Its perceptual system represents enormous amounts of information about the environment accurately. Organism B. Its perceptual system extracts only three things: edible, dangerous, mate. Organism B might actually win. Why spend metabolic resources constructing an accurate model of the universe when evolution only cares whether you successfully reproduce? The universe has never handed out prizes for epistemological fidelity. It has handed out offspring. Number three, the famous fitness beats truth argument. This became the centerpiece of Hoffman's later work. In evolutionary game theoretic models, Hoffman and collaborators compare perceptual strategies. One strategy attempts to represent the underlying state of the environment accurately. Another strategy maps environmental states directly onto fitness consequences. Their result is that the fitness-oriented strategy can outperform the truth-oriented one. Their later fitness beats truth theorem formalizes this using evolutionary game theory and Bayesian decision theory. The important conceptual distinction is truth about environment next, information useful for survival. More formally, imagine an environmental state, W, and some possible action, A. The organism doesn't ultimately care about knowing W. It cares about where F is the resulting fitness payoff. So evolution can favor a perceptual mapping that effectively says, W right arrow tech do this, rather than text construct an accurate model of W. That distinction is the mathematical heart of the argument. Number 4, a simple example, the strawberry. Imagine a strawberry. Its actual physical state involves an absurd amount of information, molecular composition, electromagnetic interactions, atomic structure, temperature, chemical gradients, microscopic geometry, quantum states, etc. Your visual system doesn't reconstruct all of that. Instead, photons, retina, neural processing, red strawberry. And red strawberry is incredibly useful. It tells you, open quote, eat this, close quote, or perhaps open quote, don't eat this because it's rotten, close quote. The perceptual system has compressed an enormous state space into a tiny symbolic representation. That's extremely efficient. The interface hypothesis says that this isn't an unfortunate limitation of perception. It is precisely what perception is for. Number 5. And then Hoffman makes the much more controversial move. Up to here, you could say, open quote, sure. Perception is simplified, close quote. Most cognitive scientists would have very little trouble with that. But Hoffman goes further. He argues that evolution doesn't merely give us an incomplete representation of reality. It may give us a representation whose structure is fundamentally unlike the structure of reality. This is where the desktop analogy becomes important. Suppose the underlying computer contains 01101111001. Your interface displays. The icon has no structural resemblance to the underlying electrical mathematical processes, yet it reliably controls them. Hoffman proposes that something similar may happen with objective reality, perceptual interface. So, text, physical object, may be analogous to desktop icon, rather than a miniature photograph of an underlying object. The 2016 overview of the theory states the claim particularly clearly. Space-time is treated as the desktop, while physical objects are icons whose shapes and colors need not resemble whatever objective reality lies beneath them. Number 6. Color is a particularly nice example. Consider red. You experience open quote, red, close quote. But what is red physically? There isn't a little packet of redness floating around in the electromagnetic field. There are electromagnetic wavelengths. Human photoreceptors respond differently to different ranges of wavelengths. Your nervous system constructs a perceptual experience. So, photoreceptor activity. Neural processing. Red. Red is therefore not necessarily a property of the external world in the form in which you experience it. It's a property of the interface. And different organisms have different interfaces. A bee sees ultraviolet, a mantis shrimp has a radically different visual system, a bat constructs an acoustic spatial representation, a snake can detect infrared. Humans get, open quote, red, green, blue, objects, surfaces, depth, solidity, distance. Close quote. There is no obvious reason to assume that the human interface is privileged. Number 7. This creates a strange consequence. Suppose humans and bats interact with the same underlying reality. The human interface might represent it as, open quote, tree, brown trunk plus green leaves, close quote. The bat's interface might represent it through, open quote, echo patterns, spatial structure, close quote. Neither necessarily resembles the underlying reality. They're different user interfaces for interacting with the same underlying system. This is why Hoffman describes perception as species-specific. The perceptual world isn't necessarily a literal depiction of the world. It is a control system. Number 8. This is where interface is a better word than illusion. This distinction is important. Hoffman isn't saying, open quote, everything you see is fake, close quote. That's actually a fairly stupid interpretation of the theory. The interface is real as an interface. If you see a cliff and walk off it, you still fall. If you see a lion and run away, that behavioral response can save your life. The claim is instead, open quote, the usefulness of a perceptual representation does not establish that the representation resembles the underlying reality. Close quote. A desktop icon isn't false. It's just not literally a tiny font. Likewise, the perceived apple is not necessarily false. It is an interface representation that allows you to interact with whatever underlying process produces the relevant fitness consequences. Number 9. Space itself becomes suspicious. This is where things become genuinely interesting. Normally we assume objects exist in space and time. Hoffman's radical proposal is closer to space and time themselves are part of the perceptual interface. In other words, space-time isn't necessarily the stage upon which reality happens. It might be part of the display. That's a considerably more profound claim. Think about a video game. The player sees a three-dimensional world, objects, distances, time, characters. But the underlying computer doesn't literally contain a miniature 3D universe. The 3D environment is generated as an interface. Hoffman asks whether space-time itself could be analogous to that rendered environment. The 2019 Stanford presentation of his work summarizes this exact proposal. Space-time is the desktop, and physical objects such as apples and neurons are icons. Number 10, and this creates the really interesting philosophical problem. If perception is an interface, then, open quote, what is the interface an interface to? Close quote. That's the question Hoffman ultimately wants to answer. The interface theory of perception itself doesn't automatically tell you what ultimate reality is. It primarily argues that text-perceived reality, netq text necessarily objective reality. But then Hoffman asks, open quote, if space-time isn't fundamental, what is? Close quote. His later work proposes a network of conscious agents as a possible underlying ontology. That is where Hoffman moves from cognitive science into metaphysics. And this transition is where the scientific status of the argument becomes much more controversial. Number 11, the crucial distinction. The paper does not prove that consciousness creates reality. This is probably the most important caveat. You'll often see Hoffman described online as saying, open quote, consciousness creates reality, close quote. That's much stronger than what the original perceptual argument establishes. The 2015 paper is primarily about perception and evolution. The argument, natural selection, fitness-oriented perception, doesn't logically entail, therefore consciousness is fundamental. There is a substantial philosophical bridge between those propositions. Hoffman himself wants to cross that bridge, but the bridge is not constructed merely by the evolutionary game theory results. Number 12. There's another subtle issue. Truth isn't necessarily all or nothing. This is one place where critics have pushed back. Suppose your perception of a tree isn't literally the underlying physical structure. Fine. That doesn't imply, open quote, your perception tells you nothing true about the tree. Close quote. A scientific realist might say, open quote, perception is an evolved, compressed, species-specific representation that nevertheless preserves some structure of the external world. Close quote. And that's a very plausible position. For example, your visual system doesn't represent every property of a tree, but it nevertheless tracks approximate location, approximate shape, motion, obstacles, surfaces, depth, causal affordances, and those relationships tend to correspond sufficiently well to the environment that you can navigate it. So there is a spectrum. Naive realism. Open quote, I perceive the world pretty much as it really is. Close quote. Scientific realism, open quote, perception is constructed and incomplete, but it preserves useful structural relationships with reality. Close quote, open quote, evolution can favor interfaces that don't preserve the underlying structure at all. Close quote. Those are substantially different positions. And there is an important criticism of Hoffman's mathematics. The mathematical result is not simply, open quote, evolution proves that perception cannot represent reality. Close quote. The models require particular assumptions about the environment, fitness functions, perceptual strategies, complexity, available information, evolutionary competition. Later work has challenged whether the conclusions generalize to more realistic environments. For example, a 2021 agent-based analysis reproduced some of the basic interface model results, but argued that under substantial environmental change, interface strategies can behave differently and potentially lose their evolutionary advantage. So the strongest intellectually honest interpretation is, open quote, Hoffman has provided a mathematically interesting argument showing that natural selection does not automatically imply veridical perception. Close quote. That's a legitimate and interesting result. It is not equivalent to, open quote, science has proven that reality is an illusion. Close quote. That latter statement is internet sludge. Number 14. But here's where the theory gets genuinely powerful. Even if you throw away Hoffman's stronger metaphysics entirely, the basic insight is profound. Evolution selects for successful interaction, not accurate description. That's a huge distinction. Consider the human concepts: objects, boundaries, colors, selves, agents, intentions, causes, categories, time, space. Some of these may correspond to genuine features of reality, but some could be compression schemes produced by nervous systems. And this connects Hoffman to a much larger family of ideas in cognitive science. For example, predictive processing. The brain doesn't passively record the world. It constructs models that predict sensory input. Ecological psychology. Perception can be understood in terms of affordances, meaning opportunities for action. A chair isn't merely, open quote, object with certain geometric properties. Close quote. It's, open quote, something I can sit on. Close quote. Bayesian perception. The brain combines sensory evidence with prior expectations to infer useful states of the environment. Evolutionary psychology. Cognitive mechanisms are shaped by selection pressures rather than necessarily by epistemic accuracy. Information theory. Sensory systems compress enormous amounts of environmental information into manageable representations. Hoffman's interface metaphor ties several of these intuitions together. Number 15. There's an even deeper question hiding underneath it. Suppose Hoffman is correct. Then you might ask, open quote, why should reality have the structure we perceive at all? Close quote. And that's where things get deliciously weird. Consider reality, right sensory interface, right text perception, act text reality. The organism isn't necessarily trying to discover the underlying ontology, it's trying to control consequences. That suggests a very different conception of cognition. Instead of, open quote, the brain builds a picture of reality. Close quote. You could say, open quote, the brain builds a control interface that lets an organism manipulate relevant variables. Close quote. That is a much more cybernetic way of thinking about perception. And it has a very interesting implication. A representation can be epistemically crude while being behaviorally excellent. A subway map is a perfect example. It deliberately lies about geography. Stations aren't actually arranged like that. Distances aren't accurate, angles aren't accurate, yet it's enormously useful, because the map preserves the relationships that matter for the task. Hoffman asks us to entertain the possibility that perception is like that, except the map is generated automatically by evolution. Number 16. One thing I'd modify in Hoffman's presentation. The phrase fitness beats truth is rhetorically excellent. It's also potentially misleading, because organisms that systematically perceive reality incorrectly eventually die. If you believe, open quote, that cliff isn't there, close quote dot and walk into it, evolution has a rather unpleasant debugging mechanism. So evolution cannot simply favor arbitrary falsehoods. The deeper point is more precise. Open quote, natural selection does not require perceptual systems to recover the full underlying structure of reality. It requires them to generate representations that produce adaptive behavior. Close quote. That's much harder to disagree with. The interesting question becomes, open quote, how much structural correspondence between perception and reality is actually necessary for adaptive behavior? Close quote. That's where the philosophical battle really is. Number 17, my overall assessment, I'd separate Hoffman's project into 3 propositions. Claim, assessment. Perception is constructed rather than a literal photograph, very well supported. Evolution optimizes fitness rather than truth, basically correct, though nuanced. Natural selection therefore favors radically non-veridical interfaces. Interesting, mathematically motivated, controversial. Space-time is an evolved perceptual interface, much more speculative. Consciousness's fundamental and physical reality emerges from conscious agents. Highly speculative metaphysics. So the first half of Hoffman is much stronger than the second half, and that's actually what makes the theory worth taking seriously. You don't need to buy the entire metaphysical package to get something extraordinarily interesting out of it. The really fascinating philosophical consequence. There is a distinction between what exists and what does a cognitive system need to represent in order to successfully interact with what exists. Human cognition evolved primarily for the second problem. Science, however, attempts to solve the first. And science itself is conducted by organisms whose perceptual systems evolved for survival. That produces a delicious epistemological loop. Boxed, text, an evolved cognitive system. Writext builds models of reality. Text uses those models to investigate reality. So the question becomes, open quote, how can a system whose perceptual machinery evolved for fitness rather than truth nevertheless discover truths that transcend its perceptual interface? Close quote. That, to me, is actually the most interesting version of Hoffman's problem. Because science clearly does uncover things that human perception never evolved to perceive directly. Atoms, curved spacetime, quantum fields, DNA, gravitational waves, deep geological time, etc., which suggests something intriguing. Perhaps evolution gives us an interface, but cognition plus mathematics lets us partially reverse engineer the hidden structure behind the interface. And that is a considerably more interesting proposition than reality is an illusion. The latter fits nicely on a YouTube thumbnail. The former is an actual epistemological problem. If you're interested in Hoffman's work specifically, the natural next step is to unpack his evolutionary game theory model mathematically, because that's where the argument either earns its keep or starts quietly smuggling philosophy in through the back door.
Yeah, okay. So I'm very interested in continuing Hoffman's work, and I like your suggestion for the next natural step. So how do we go about that? Can you help me? Because yeah, I do notice that he very sneakily, at least for me, because obviously I'm not in academia and those are very high levels and such. I am not able to distinguish the exact moment where he slips in philosophy and metaphysics and speculation and his own personal beliefs. Um, Although he's very articulate and sometimes he does like clarify like okay, so now we're getting into territories that are above my pay grade, right? Or sometimes he's like, this is just my theory, this is, or not theory, sorry, just my opinion. But he's like also very vocal in his um, how he rigorous uh, mm, thinking and testing pursues like from his scientific mind. But yeah, I guess I'm not gonna be able to understand everything in detail for the mathematical part. But I hope I at least I can get the gist. So oh my god, why did I stop it? Oh no, I didn't stop it. Okay, good. Is it? Is it?
Yes, I dug into it. And this is one of those songs where.
What the heck is happening, bro? Is it still thinking? Is it actually searching? I don't think so. ChatGPT hasta aquí. What? Chinga, pues ¿cuál tengo yo? ¿Qué? What do you mean, bro? OpenAI. ChatGPT Classic. The official 4.3 developer tools. So this is uh so this is called Classic now. Okay, whatever. So there's no update. What? Stop thinking. How can I resend it? Edit. Creo que ahora sí está jalando, a ver. Reload. There it is. No. Yes, and your instinct. A ver.
Yes, and your instinct about Hoffman is exactly where I would put the intellectual pressure. The useful thing here is not to become an expert in evolutionary game theory overnight. It is to learn to identify the transitions. Open quote, empirical result, mathematical result, interpretation, philosophical inference, metaphysical commitment, close quote. Hoffman can move between those levels very smoothly. Smooth prose can make a logical jump feel like a deduction. Humans invented rhetoric partly to make this sort of thing possible, apparently. So let's do this systematically. The roadmap I would take Hoffman's argument in 5 layers, rather than trying to swallow the entire theory at once. Layer 1, the evolutionary problem. First establish the basic question. Open quote, does natural selection favor organisms that perceive reality accurately? Close quote. We'll construct a toy world with perhaps 2 environmental states and 2 possible actions. For example, reality, action A, action B, state 1, fitness 10, fitness 1, state fitness 1, fitness 10. An organism that accurately distinguishes state 1 from state 2 can choose the appropriate action. So far, nothing controversial. Then we introduce perceptual representations. The organism doesn't directly access the state. It receives some representation, W right arrow X, where minus W equals actual environmental state, X equals perceptual representation. Then we ask, open quote, what representation maximizes expected reproductive success? Close quote. That is the key move. Now layer 2, truth versus fitness. Now we can make the distinction precise. Imagine 2 possible perceptual strategies. Strategy T, truth-oriented. The organism represents the environmental states with high fidelity. Strategy F, fitness-oriented. The organism represents states according to the actions they make advantageous. The interesting possibility is tech strategy F, tech strategy T in reproductive success. If that happens, then natural selection has no reason to preserve strategy T merely because it is more accurate. This is the point behind Hoffman's later fitness beats truth work. And here I want to be very careful with terminology. It does not mean, open quote, fitness literally defeats truth, close quote. Truth isn't a contestant in an evolutionary boxing match. It means something more specific, open quote. Maximizing the accuracy of one's representation is not in general identical to maximizing one's fitness, close quote. That's a much more defensible statement. At layer 3, the interface. Once we've established that, Hoffman asks, open quote, what if perception is systematically optimized for fitness rather than truth? Close quote. Then perception begins to look like a user interface. Suppose reality contains W equals W01, W2, 3 dots, WN. But the organism only needs to distinguish food, tech, next, obstacle. The perceptual system can compress the enormous state space into a tiny number of categories, and importantly, many different OTECs, same perceptual icon. So the perceptual representation is many to one. That's information loss. But information loss isn't necessarily a defect. JPEG compression loses information. A subway map loses geographical information. A computer desktop loses almost all information about the electrical state of the machine. Yet all 3 are useful. This is the intuition behind Hoffman's interface theory. Nash layer 4, the controversial leap. Now we arrive at the part you correctly identified as slippery. From, open quote, perception is an adaptive interface, close quote. Hoffman eventually moves toward, open quote, space and time themselves may be part of the interface, close quote. That is a different proposition. The first is an evolutionary cognitive hypothesis. The second is an ontological hypothesis. And they should not be allowed to borrow evidential credibility from each other. This is one of the things I'd like to keep doing as we work through Hoffman. Empirical, supported by observations, experiments. Mathematical follows from specified assumptions within a formal model. Interpretive, a reasonable interpretation of the mathematical empirical results. Philosophical, a broader conceptual argument. Metaphysical, a claim about what reality fundamentally is, that color coding will be useful, because Hoffman sometimes goes without the boundary between them being especially conspicuous. Of layer 5, conscious agents. And only after we've understood the previous 4 should we get into his really radical proposal. Open quote, consciousness is fundamental. Close quote. His later formalism involves what he calls conscious agents. Very roughly, instead of starting with text physical world conscious organisms, he reverses the direction. Text conscious agents, text physical world as interface. That's enormously more controversial. And critically, the evolutionary argument does not by itself establish this. That's where we need to be particularly ruthless about separating. Open quote, this follows from the model, close quote, from open quote, this is the ontology Hoffman thinks makes the most sense. Close quote, those are not equivalent. How I'd actually teach this to you, rather than dumping equations on you, I'd use a progressive reconstruction. We'll essentially recreate Hoffman's argument ourselves. Step 1, build a tiny evolutionary world. Step 2, introduce organisms. Step 3, give them different perceptual strategies. Step 4, calculate expected fitness. Step 5, allow natural selection to operate. Step 6, see whether accurate perception actually wins. Step 7, change the environmental assumptions. Step 8, see where Hoffman's conclusion breaks or survives. Step 9, only then introduce the formal mathematics from the papers. Step 10, finally examine the transition from text fitness-driven perception to interface theory, and then from conscious agent ontology. That gives you something much better than merely understanding Hoffman. You'd be able to audit Hoffman. And there's a particularly nice experiment we can do. I'll give you a very simple hypothetical evolutionary environment. You won't need calculus. You won't even need advanced probability initially. I'll give you perhaps 3 environmental states, 3 possible perceptions, and 3 possible actions with fitness payoffs. Then I'll ask you to predict which perceptual strategy natural selection should favor. After you make your prediction, I'll show you the calculation. Then we'll deliberately construct a case where less accurate perception, quad text, higher fitness. That's the moment where Hoffman's argument becomes intuitive, rather than merely something you've heard him say. And once that clicks, we can progressively increase the mathematical sophistication until you're looking at the actual formal structure used in the papers, rather than a popularized version of it. That seems like the right route for you, specifically, because the objective shouldn't be understand Hoffman's conclusions. It should be understand enough of the machinery to determine which conclusions are actually earned by the machinery.
30. 6 right, into 4 left, tightens of a crest. Into 6 right, very long, 30. Keep right of a jump, into 6 left, extra long, tightens 4, into 4 right, and 4 right. Into 4 left long, tightens turn 3, opens of a crest, into 4 right, and 6 left, 80, 4 left, slow 70, turn unseen, 1 right. Tarmac, 300. Keep right, into turn, 1 left, between bales. Six right, opens 80. Flat crest, slow 60. 3 left long, tightens turn 1, don't cut. 40, gravel, 5 right over crest, extra long. Opens 6 of a jump long. Into caution 40, 3 left over crest. Opens. Into 6 right long of a crest. Into 6 left long, opens, keep middle of a big jump, 30. 6 right of a crest, into immediate 6 left, 100 of a jumps, tightens of a crest, into 3 left, keep right of a 30, 6 left, 30, 5 right, into 6 left long, opens of a finish, 80, to stop.
A ver, pues. All right, yeah, I like where this is going. So let's go ahead and start.
Into 6 left, 50,
Yes, mira. Do a barrel roll. Heat for higher.
Good. Let's do it from the ground up and resist the temptation to let Hoffman sneak a metaphysical grand piano through the tiny evolutionary game theory door. Hap Lesson 1. Does evolution reward truth? We need a toy universe. Imagine a species of little organisms living in an environment with 2 possible states. State A, food is on the left. State B, food is on the right. The organism has 2 possible actions. Action L, go left. Action R, go right. The fitness consequences are reality, go left, go right. A, food left, 10, 0. B, food right, 0, 10. The numbers aren't important. They're just reproductive payoff. So if the organism knew reality perfectly, A, right arrow R, and it gets fitness 10 every time. Seems obvious. Now comes the important part. The organism doesn't get to see reality directly. Let's introduce a perceptual system. The actual state of the environment is W in AB. The organism receives a percex, and then chooses an action, AC. So the causal chain is box W right arrow X right arrow AC text fitness. Notice something subtle. The organism's ultimate evolutionary problem isn't, open quote, what is W, close quote. Its evolutionary problem is, open quote, which action should I take, close quote. That's already the beginning of Hoffman's argument. Strategy 1, accurate perception. Suppose the organism has an excellent perceptual system. When reality is A, right arrow XA. When reality is B, right arrow XB. It can distinguish the 2 perfectly. Therefore, XA, right arrow L, X bar. Fitness, F equals 10 every time. Beautiful. At this point, truth and fitness are aligned. If the organism accurately represents the environment, it makes the right decision. So why wouldn't evolution simply produce increasingly accurate perception? This is where things get interesting. Strategy 2, a deliberately compressed representation. Imagine that the environment becomes much more complicated. Instead of just 2 states, there are 1 million possible physical states. But from the organism's perspective, those million states ultimately boil down to 2 useful categories. Text good for me, or text bad for me. Suppose W1, W2, W3, L.W500 all lead to essentially the same beneficial action. And the remaining, W5001, L dots W1000, lead to the opposite action. An accurate representation would have to distinguish a huge number of environmental states, but the organism doesn't need that information. It can simply compress W1, L dots W1000, text, and upload 5001 the raptor. This is already much closer to ordinary cognitive science than to metaphysics. And notice what happened. The organism has thrown away information about reality, yet it might become better adapted. Now let's make it slightly more interesting. Suppose there are actually 3 environmental states: reality, correct action, fitness, A left 10, B right 10, C left 10. An accurate perceptual system might distinguish A, B, C, but it turns out that distinguishing A from C is completely unnecessary. Both require, so a simpler perceptual system can represent AC, right arrow XL, B, right arrow XR. It has less information about reality, but it performs equally well. Already we have accurate fitness. Not because inaccurate perception is advantageous. Rather, because additional accuracy can be completely irrelevant to fitness. That's an important first crack in the intuitive argument. But Hoffman wants something stronger. Someone could reasonably respond, open quote, fine, evolution doesn't care about irrelevant information, but surely, whenever information actually matters to survival, accurate perception will be favored. Close quote. That's a much stronger objection. So let's construct a situation where something rather strange happens. Imagine 2 environmental states, W1 and W2, but each contains enormous amounts of information. The organism could try to construct an extremely detailed internal representation of the environment. Call that strategy text truth-oriented perception. Alternatively, it could have a brutally compressed interface, F equals fitness-oriented perception. The interface doesn't attempt to reconstruct the environment. Instead, it maps environmental situations directly into useful behavioral categories. Something like W right arrow box run, or now the question becomes, open quote, which organism leaves more offspring, close quote. And that is the question natural selection actually evaluates. Not, open quote, which organism possesses the more accurate ontology, close quote. Here's the conceptual switch. Imagine you're designing a dashboard for a nuclear reactor. You could display every temperature measurement, every pressure fluctuation, every valve state, every chemical concentration, every microscopic measurement, every electrical signal. Or you could display, open quote, safe warning meltdown imminent, close quote. The second interface is catastrophically less informative about the reactor. But if your only task is, open quote, tell the operator when to hit the emergency shutdown button, close quote dot, then the second interface could actually be better. This is the core intuition behind the interface theory. The organism isn't necessarily a scientist trying to reconstruct reality. It's an agent trying to survive. Now here's your first exercise. Don't worry about getting this right. The point is to expose the intuition that we're going to attack. Imagine an environment with 4 states: reality, action, L fitness, action, R fitness, A 10-0, B 10-0, C 0-10, D 0-10. So A, B, D right arrow R. There are 2 perceptual systems. System T, it perfectly distinguishes all 4, A, B, D. System F, it only does 2 categories, A, B right arrow XL, right arrow XR. Your task, which system should natural selection favour? And more importantly, is System F less accurate, equally accurate, or is that question itself becoming badly formulated? That second question is the interesting one. Take a shot at it before I show you what happens when we start introducing costs, probabilities, and competing organisms.
And you have them compete. Today I'll talk about consciousness and the interface theory of perception. 1/3 of your brain's cortex is engaged in vision. When you simply open your eyes and look around, you're using billions of neurons and trillions of synapses just to see the world in this room. This might be a bit surprising to most of us because to the extent that we think about vision at all, we think of it as like a camera. Vision is just a process of taking a snapshot of a world that exists out there that has objects, colors, shapes, and motions. So there is a part of vision that is like a camera, and that is the eye. The eye has a lens which focuses an image on the back of the eye where there's a piece of tissue called the retina, about 120 million photoreceptors and 200 million interneurons that do sophisticated processing, very, very sophisticated piece of computational hardware. It's also an example of unintelligent design. The light goes through the lens, and it has to go through all the interneurons and blood vessels before it reaches the photoreceptors, which are behind. That's really bad design. That's true of vertebrate eyes. It's not true of cephalopod eyes. They have it right. The photoreceptors are in front, the interneurons and the blood vessels are behind. We got the B model. So why all this horsepower in the brain just to look? The idea from cognitive neuroscience is that perception, vision, is really a reality engine. In real time, you're creating all the depths, colors, motions, shapes, textures, and objects that you see. So you are creating the reality that you experience right now. You're not just taking a snapshot of a world that was already there. So for example, just a couple concrete examples. This table and that table have exactly the same shape of the tabletop. One might look long and thin, the other short and fat, but they're exactly the same shape. Your visual system has rules for creating 3D shapes, and we understand those rules, and they force you to see things, in this case, incorrectly. And I know you probably don't believe me on this. You're welcome to come up some other time afterwards and measure them on my screen. They're exactly the same shapes. See if this works. The top and the bottom probably look very, very different shades of gray, the top and the bottom. But they're exactly the same shades of gray, and you can prove it with your own finger. Close one eye, put your finger over the boundary between the top and the bottom, and you'll see they're the same shade of gray. So you have a magic finger. So even your perception of shades of gray is a construction. You're constructing that reality in real time. It's a perceptual reality. It's not an objective reality. You see the 3D shapes. You see the shades of gray that you create. You probably see a cube floating in front of disks. In fact, the cube that you see is entirely your hallucination. All I've done is put little disks with cutouts. And you notice that your visual system notices that these cutouts line up, and so you actually hallucinate the glowing, you probably see a glowing line across. That's you're hallucinating that. And then you hallucinate the 3D cube that you see, and you probably see that it can flip, the cube can flip back and forth. How many get the cube flipping? Okay, so what that shows is that you first hallucinate the lines, then you build a new hallucination on top of that of a 3D shape, and then you notice you can build two of those, so you flip back and forth between the two. And to prove that you're creating the 3D, the glow of the lines, think of the disks as holes in a sheet of paper. You're looking through the holes, and behind you see a cube. How many get that to happen? Notice when you get that to happen, the glow stops. Do you notice that? So that proves that you create the glowing lines and you turn them off when you decide to put the cube behind. Your visual system is creating the lines, is putting the glow, it's all you. It's not there on the screen. You create all the colors that you see. Light has no color. If you asked a physicist, does light have color? They'd say no, it has frequency, wavelength, but not color. That square and that square. That one and that one. Same color or different? You know the answer is supposed to be that they're the same. They're actually identical inks. And I'm just going to remove some context. Put it back. I'll go back again. Watch the yellow one turn brown. Now watch it ramp back up to yellow. You're actually seeing your own visual system change the color in real time. You're computing that color in real time. One more time. This is a lot of fun. Right. So there it is. It's yellow. Watch it change to brown. You're actually seeing your creative powers in action. Then it goes back to yellow. Turns the glow back on. So that's all you. Yeah. This is all no drugs. That's great. So you create everything that you see, but your visual consciousness is different than you might think. On this demonstration, both screens, I'll show you one picture, a blank screen, and then the same picture, but there's something different. There's something that's been changed. Can you find it? I'll give you just 1 second to try to find it. Yeah, if you might let other people have a chance first. So there's a boat back here that appears and disappears. I'll give you another chance here. So maybe just raise your hand when you know it. Aha, this one's a little tricky. So this one took me about a minute. By the way, there's no correlation between the IQ and the time it takes to... So you don't want to leave home without this. It's the engine on both sides. So notice that you see less. You're not a camera. You're not taking a picture of the whole scene. You're creating, but you only create where you really attend. One more chance, real quick one. Just raise your hand if you get it. Couple, okay. Notice the bar behind them going up and down. So notice that after you know what it is, you can't help but see it. But before, you were blind to it. Quite striking. So vision is a constructive process. What I've told you so far is all standard. What's also standard in cognitive neuroscience is the idea that perception is reconstruction. The argument is an evolutionary argument. Those of our ancestors that saw the world more truly were at a fitness advantage compared to those who didn't. And so we are the offspring. The ones that saw more truly had a better chance of having kids and surviving. And so we are the offspring of those who saw more truly. So our perceptions, although they're constructions, are in fact reconstructions of the truth of the 3D world out there. That's the standard story in cognitive neuroscience. Perception estimates true properties of the physical world. Evolution guarantees that these estimates are accurate, and perception is therefore generally veridical, which is a fancy name for true. This is the standard story, and I think is completely bogus. It misunderstands evolution completely. In my lab, we've been doing studies of evolution using mathematical models called evolutionary game theory and genetic algorithms, where you can actually create perceptual strategies. You can create any world that you want in the computer, in fact, millions of them at random. You create perceptual strategies for organisms competing in those worlds. Some of the organisms see all the truth of that world. You play God in this world, so you say they will have all the truth in their perceptions. And others are only tuned to fitness. And you have them compete, and you penalize them for costs, for the time it takes to get their perceptions, the information costs, computational costs. And the bottom line is, in these competitions, in world after world, truth goes extinct. It's not the most fit strategy. And instead, something that I'll call an interface strategy, and I'll tell you what that is, that's just tuned to fitness, drives truth to extinction all the time. And when we do genetic algorithms, truth doesn't even come on the stage. It never evolves. So in evolutionary games, we put truth on the stage and it dies. In genetic algorithm, it never gets on the stage. So this has led me to think about perception in a different way. If perceptions have not evolved to be true, how can they be useful? I mean, how can our perceptions, we usually think of perceptions as being useful because they're true. They're telling us about the truth of the world. So I think a helpful metaphor is the desktop interface on your computer. Your desktop has nice little graphics like this blue rectangular, I don't think I can get, you see the blue rectangular file icon there, right? So that icon is blue, rectangular, and in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Does that mean that the file itself in the computer is blue, rectangular, or in the lower right-hand corner of the disk drive? Not at all. I mean, anybody who thought that doesn't understand the purpose of the interface. The colors are not supposed to represent the true colors of files because files don't have colors. The shapes aren't supposed to represent the true shapes because files don't have shapes. And the positions don't represent true positions. So the whole point of the interface is not to tell you the truth, it's to hide the truth, right? You don't want to know about the diodes, the resistors, the megabytes of software, the voltages, the magnetic fields. If you had to know all that, you could not write your program, edit your image, whatever. You couldn't, write your email. So the whole point of the interface, it's useful because it hides the truth and it gives you a dumbed down, pretty guide to behavior. It's guiding your behaviors so that you can get done what you need to do. And that's the idea about perception. The idea about perception then from the interface is that space and time that we perceive are a species-specific desktop. Space and time is our desktop, and what we call physical objects are the icons on our desktop. And to ask if they're the truth or not is the same mistake as asking if is the file really blue and really rectangular. It's just the wrong question. Our perceptions did not evolve to even deal with truth. They're there to hide the truth. So what we call the physical world has been evolved by natural selection actually to hide the truth and just guide adaptive behavior. What is the context of truth I was using? The nice thing about being the creator of a computer program is you get to play God. So you can say, this is the world, and you write down a mathematical structure. And then you say that the perceptions of the organism are exactly isomorphic to the mathematical structure of that world. So you can actually say, let it be so, and it is. So the interface theory says that space-time is not the truth. What we call the physical world is not the truth. It's not intended to be the truth. We've evolved not to see the truth, but to hide the truth. It's too complicated. The truth is too complicated. We don't need to know it. Space-time is our desktop. Physical objects, like this podium, are just the icons of that desktop. Now, the obvious question then to me in many cases is, well, Hoffman, if you think that train coming down the tracks at 200 miles an hour is just an icon of your desktop, why don't you step in front of it? And after you're dead and your theory with you, we'll know that the train was real. And the answer is, I wouldn't step in front of the train for the same reason I wouldn't drag that file icon to the trash carelessly. Not because I take the icon literally, the file's not blue, but I do take it seriously. If I drag that icon to the trash, I could lose a year of work. The same thing with the train icon. I don't take it literally, it's just an icon. But I've been shaped by evolution to have symbols that, although they're not true, I need to take seriously. If I don't, I'll go extinct. And those of our ancestors who didn't, they're not here. They weren't our ancestors, actually. The desktop then gives us a fiction of causality. We think that when one object hits another, a billiard ball hits another one, that it causes it to move. Well, that's just a useful fiction on the desktop. If I drag the icon to the trash can, it looks like the movement of the icon to the trash can caused it to delete the file. That's a nice fiction of causality, but in fact, it's just a fiction. And so causality in physical space is also a fiction. And that then raises, now we move into the consciousness side. If our perceptions of what we call the physical world are just a useful fiction, and there's no causality in that physical world, that then means we have to rethink the mind-body problem. The standard view is that physical properties such as neural activity of the brain causes consciousness. But if this interface theory is correct, then no physical object has any causal powers, and that includes the brain. The brain causes none of my perceptions, it causes none of my actions. It's a nice symbol, it's a dumbed down symbol. It seems complicated to us, but it's the dumbed down symbol that we use when we look inside of heads. So, I've been working to develop a theory of consciousness. I mean, I do want a science of consciousness, where I recognize that a scientific description of consciousness is not consciousness, just like a scientific description of the weather is not weather. You don't need to put on your rain suit when you run a simulation of the weather. And you don't need to put on, worry that consciousness will emerge from a scientific theory. But nevertheless, as a scientist, I want to try to get a mathematical model of consciousness that's precise so that I can be precisely wrong. That's the whole point of science, is to be precise enough so that people can say, here's why you're wrong, and then you can try to fix it. So that's my goal. So here's the idea. The idea about consciousness, and I'm going to define something called a conscious agent, is there is the world, where I won't specify what the world is right now. The world somehow leads rise to my conscious experiences, qualia and other conscious experiences. Those then, I make decisions about how I'm going to act. Based on what I perceive, I make decisions about what actions I will take, and those actions then go back and affect the world. So there's this closed loop. That's the basic idea. So now you turn it into mathematics. W stands for the world. X stands for the conscious experiences of the agent, and G is for the potential actions. You might say, why not A? I'll use that in a moment. So G is for something called groups. So now there's going to be a map from the world to my conscious experiences. I'll call that P. There's just some kind of mapping. Then the conscious agent will have to make a decision. So there'll be some mapping D, which in some sense expresses the free will choices of the conscious agent. And then the action that you take then is a mapping that changes the state of the world. And every time you have a conscious experience, we have a counter that says +1. Another conscious experience, another one. So you're counting the conscious experiences. You have a counter, right? So my definition, a conscious agent is these 7 items: W, X, G, the world, experience, my set of actions; P, the perceptual map; D, my decision map, which is my conscious will; A, my actions, my action map, which changes the world; and N, which is my counter of experiences. So a conscious agent is mathematically a 7-tuple, so there it is, where, now here's the math. I'll assume that W, X, and G are so-called probability spaces, so that I can talk about the probability of having this experience or that. So it's the most general assumption that allows me to talk about the probability of making a certain decision, decision G, having experience X, and changing the world W. The maps that I talked about, the P, the perception, decision, action maps, are all going to be Markovian kernels. That's the most general formalism that allows me to have probabilistic changes from one to the other, to map the world probabilistically onto my experiences. For those of you who know information theory and communication theory, these Markovian kernels are in fact identical to communication channels. So you can think of each one as a communication channel. If you know linear algebra, each of these is just a matrix whose rows sum to 1. So that's the mathematical content of it, for those who know that stuff. And N is an integer, right? You're just counting up the number of experiences that you have. So it's not that difficult a mathematical structure. And then, now here's where part of going out on a limb, making risky claims, I claim what I call the conscious agent thesis, that every conscious entity and every conscious activity can be modeled by interacting conscious agents. That's the claim. It's in a similar spirit to the Church-Turing thesis in the theory of computation. Turing proposed this formalism called the Turing machine and made the claim that every effective procedure can be written as an instance of this abstract formalism that he wrote down. And it turns out that that was the foundation of computer science. That allowed all sorts of important theorems and proofs to be made about computer science. And it's a falsifiable hypothesis. If you could find an effective procedure that couldn't be instantiated as a Turing machine, that would falsify his hypothesis, but it's not really provable. So I'm proposing this thesis in the same spirit as the Church-Turing thesis. I'm proposing this is the formalism that handles all of consciousness. If you find a counterexample, I'm wrong. But quite that simple. So the conscious realism thesis then says, what is the world? Because there's that world W, right, in the definition of the agent. And by the way, that's where the theory is non-dual, because the world is actually in the definition of the conscious agent itself, is not separate. So the conscious realism thesis says that the world W itself consists of conscious agents. So the whole game is consciousness. That's the proposal. So these are very clean, falsifiable hypotheses. So we can talk about two conscious agents, 1 and 2, and here I've written their structures. So the world, the perceptual map, the experiences, the decision map, the actions, and then the action map, and the experience counter for each agent. Why is there more than one agent? Well, ultimately, we're going to be looking at a dynamics of interactions of agents, but it's going to turn out that under many circumstances, when two agents interact, it becomes a theorem of this mathematics that a new single agent appears. So the nice thing about the mathematics is it makes precise mathematical predictions about consciousness and about when self-awareness actually comes out, and I'll show you at top level what that is. So I'm going to take these two agents, and the conscious realism thesis says that the W has to be conscious agent. So I'm going to make, in this particular example, the world for agent 1 be agent 2, and vice versa. So I'm going to take agent 1, I'm going to open them up a little bit, all right? And I'm going to plug in to W another agent. This is conscious realism now, mathematically realized. Other agents. No, each agent is perceiving other agents, and you might be, the nexus of agents that you're interacting with will determine the kinds of perceptions you have. Also, your space X and G will be different from agent to agent. So we can have a wide range of different agents, right? X, it could be the conscious experiences of you, and it could represent the experiences of a bat. So very, very widely different conscious experiences. You can think of X, for example, as being, when the agent's not perceiving at all, it's the potentiality of conscious experiences. It's consciousness with silence, no content. But when this thing actually interacts, then you get the content. So the mathematics actually allows us to talk about consciousness without content, the silent consciousness. So here I have two conscious agents now interacting, and you can see the direction of the arrows. The information is flowing in a cycle around this, and the experience counters keep going around as they interact. The compatibility condition is that, for this to happen, is that the actions of one equal the perceptions of the other. So you have a mathematical compatibility constraint for them to interact. You can write this abstractly too. You can just think of two conscious agents, C1 and C2. One is sending messages. So here's a sender, here's a sender, receiver, and the information is cycling between them. You have conscious experiences happening here, free will decisions. So this is the consciousness as will, and then consciousness as action. So consciousness is conscious experience, free will, and then free action. You can put three of them together. I'm simplifying. I showed you two, but there's a complete combinatorics. You can put any number of these together. That's one way to put three together. Here's another way to put three together. Have them all interacting. You can put four together. So all of a sudden you get very interesting lattices of arbitrary complexity of interacting conscious agents. Now the mathematics says, there's a theorem, that whenever two connected conscious agents occur, when actually two agents are connected, a new conscious agent is thereby instantiated. A new single conscious agent emerges. And it's what I call the introspecting conscious agent. So you have the two agents that are interacting with each other, and the new single agent can sort of be described this way. It has its receiver, here's its receiver, the experiences that it's getting. This is its free will decision, that's the sender. I showed on. So the receiver, the conscious experiences, the free will choices, and then the actions, which are the senders. And what this agent is doing is, it is its own world. It is perceiving itself, so this is introspection. So the mathematics of this theory says that as soon as you have two agents interacting, the mathematics says there will be conscious introspection. It's just part of the theorem. So that means introspection is far more ubiquitous than perhaps we thought. Now I'll give you a concrete example of the kinds of dynamics that can happen. As you can see, it's infinitely complicated, right? The agents here have enough structure. They're in terms of computation power, they're universal. Anything that you want to compute can be computed with these things. And any architecture you want can be instantiated with them. So it's a very, very powerful framework. But I'm going to give you one trivial example. This is the experiences of the one agent, and it can only experience what I'll call 0 and 1, like red and green. That's all it can experience. These are the only actions it can take, 0 and 1. This is the experiences of the other agent, 0 and 1. Say it can see blue and green. That's all it can see. And these are the only actions it can take. And then these arrows indicate some simple probabilities. This agent, if it experiences green, it sends out action 0. If it sees red, it sends out action 1. These are then just transported without change around this architecture. In this particular example, you could have these things crossing, you could have these be non-trivial probabilities. I'm showing you one example out of an infinity just to be concrete.
5, 4,
So I hope you see
3,
what's happening
2,
is these are the conscious experiences, these are the actions, and these arrows, these are experiences, these are actions, and the arrows are the perceptual and action and decision maps that I was talking
3
about.
left long, 70.
Now the question is, how do we relate this theory of consciousness to what we call the physical world? Because if we want to solve the mind-body problem, and we're starting with consciousness, then my constraint is I have to get physics from my theory of consciousness. Otherwise, again, I'm falsifying. If I cannot derive all of physics from just this basic thesis of the definition of conscious agents and conscious realism, so one definition and one postulate, that's all I'm starting with. My burden is then to get all of quantum field theory and eventually quantum gravity from just this foundation. If I can't do it, I'm wrong. So that's, it's very, very clear. So I'm just going to show you at top level the connections that I've already made and the connections I'm hoping to make. Whenever you have a dynamics like this, it turns out that there is going to be cyclic behavior. And in this particular case, these cycles are a state. This says 0, 0, 0, 0. The first thing over here is 0, 0, 0, 0. What I'm saying is, suppose I start off these two agents where this agent is seeing 0, its action is 0, this one is seeing 0, and that action is 0. Suppose that's how we start off the dynamics. And now we start letting the arrows act on that dynamics. What's going to happen? Well, at the next step, when n goes to the next step, right, you increment your experience counter, you'll go to 0, 1, 0, 0. So this will still be a 0. This will now be a 1, because see 0 goes to 1, right? But the rest of them will still be zeros. And if you actually work through it, you'll see that you go through 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and so forth, all the way back to 1, 0, 0, 0, and then you cycle back to where you started, 0, 0, 0, 0. So you cycle through 8 states in this particular simple example, right? Very, very simple, just to illustrate the point. So you get a cycle through 8 states. And then there's another one. If you start off with 0, 0, 0, 1, you get a different cycle of 8 states. Okay? So those are called absorbing sets. And it turns out that in the theory of Markov chains, because these are Markov chains, you can actually characterize this so-called long-term behavior, asymptotic behavior of the system in terms of the eigenfunctions. So the states are the 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, and so forth. Those are the states S. D is the cycle period. In this particular case, 8, because you went through 8 different states to get back to where you were. N is the step time, 1, 2, 3, so forth. And it turns out that the mathematical description that falls out from the theory of conscious agents now, so this is the mathematical description of the long-term behavior that comes from just the mathematics of conscious agents, is this weird equation here. Pretty nasty, but notice that it involves an imaginary number, e to the I, times cis theta is, the CIS is cosine theta minus I sine theta. 5? Okay. So this says how the long-term behavior of the agents maps out mathematically. Here is the wave function of the quantum-free particle. They're mathematically identical.
2 left long opens.
In fact,
And 3
let's
right
put them close together.
crest, 40.
What you can see
6 right.
is that
And kinks.
the position,
6 right, 40.
X of the particle, corresponds to the state S
90.
of the dynamics of the conscious agents.
Kinks, over crest, narrows.
The
Into 6
time
left long,
t
80.
for the particle corresponds to the experience
3
counter
right,
of
caution,
the
don't
agents.
cut, keep in. 170, widens.
The
2
period
right, don't cut.
D
And 3
of
right.
the agents corresponds
And
to
4 right,
the
long,
both
100.
the central time period and
6
the
left,
wavelength
100, over crest.
of the particle,
6 right, long, 40.
and
Brake,
that the speed of
5 right,
light
50.
is in units of
2
1.
right, long, opens, don't cut.
That the momentum is actually
5 left,
Planck's
short.
constant over the D,
Into
the
2
period
left,
of
very
the
long,
conscious
tightens
agents,
late.
and that the energy is Planck's constant times C, which are both 1 in these units, divided by D, the period of the conscious agent dynamics. So in other words, we, from the
And 2 right,
asymptotic,
60.
the idea then is that physical particles are identical to
4 left, tightens, 50.
asymptotic behaviors of the dynamics of conscious agents.
Caution,
That's
4
the
left,
connection.
long, tightens.
Asymptotic
Keep in,
dynamics of
50.
conscious agents are what we
Crest,
represent in our
40.
little space-time interface
4 left,
as
over
particles.
crest.
And
And
that allows us
7,
to
5
read
right,
off a
short.
solution to the mind-body
130,
problem
goes straight,
in terms
50.
of how states of the dynamics are equivalent
Brake,
to
4
physical
left,
properties
tightens, 100.
of the particles. So I'm going to do a couple claims and replies and then just hint where I'm going with this. So one claim about
5
consciousness
right,
and
long.
science is that consciousness can't be measured or observed. I would claim
Kinks,
rather that
over
consciousness,
crest,
if
into
what I've been
6
saying is
right,
correct,
long, 60.
consciousness is the only thing that science has
6
ever
left,
observed.
into 5 right, go right.
And in
Into
reply,
5 right,
consciousness is
tightens,
subjective and
keep
private
in.
physical objects
And
are
kinks,
objective in
60.
public. And if you look at this very, very carefully, it turns out that there
Caution,
are
2
no
left,
public physical
short,
objects.
don't cut,
A
and
spoon
4 right, very long, tightens
or this
late,
podium
40.
is no more public than your headache.
5 left, 40.
We can both talk about headaches and communicate because we've both had them, but there's no public headache. In the same way, we can both talk about
4
the
right, tightens,
podium that
and
we're each
4
creating
left, long,
as
don't cut,
perceptual experiences, but there's no public podium because
and
podiums
4
aren't
right,
part of
tightens,
objective reality.
40.
There's no scientifically
4 left.
testable theory of consciousness.
And 4
Conscious
right,
agents
over
are such a
crest,
theory.
go straight, 40.
It's a
5 left.
falsifiable theory.
And 5 right, long,
Finally, qualia,
130.
conscious experiences can't be scientifically studied or
6
mathematically
left,
described.
keep
Yes, they
out,
can.
70.
This is done by the
Flat
field of
left,
psychophysics, which is a
70.
field that I'm involved in.
Caution,
That's where a lot of
kinks,
this mathematics
over
came
crest,
from,
into
was
2
the study of
left.
psychophysics and the math models that we've gotten there.
And 2 right opens, go right.
So just in the last minute, I'll just say where I'm going. This is the speculative part. The connection that I
5
showed
right,
you
long,
is between
opens,
conscious agents,
40.
asymptotic dynamics,
5 right,
and
short,
non-relativistic
130.
physics. The equation I gave you was for
5
non-relativistic
right,
particles.
keep in, 80.
Of course, you need to go to a relativistic situation, and for that I'll just
Right.
sketch. This is
And 6
at the
left,
edges of what I'm
into
doing,
5
so
right,
I hope I'm not wrong.
60. 2 left,
Two agents
opens,
interacting.
150.
There are 4 variables that are involved. There's the N1 and N2, the experience counters, X1 and X2, which are the experiences themselves, the state of the experiences, and G1 and G2, which are the choices of actions for the 2 agents. So, and it turns out when you look at this, that you can write down what's called a geometric algebra, G of 2, 4, where the N1 and N2 have positive signature in the algebra, and the other variables, X's and G's, have negative signature. And this is the geometric algebra of conformal spacetime. So this is the conformal spacetime algebra. It turns out that this is the algebra that's used in relativistic descriptions of particles. For example, Dirac spinors fall right out of this, and Penrose's twisters. So my next direction is to actually show that when you have 2 agents like this, that their dynamics actually forms the base of the massless relativistic particle description in physics at the Planck scale. And then the idea is that mass comes in later as a symmetry breaking, where the symmetry breaking is you have other agents that then start to communicate with these 2 agents. So the 2 agents that are just interacting, that's the symmetry. When another agent starts to interact with them, you have a symmetry breaking, and that's where mass comes in and different scales of time. This is all speculative, and thank you very much.
All right, we have Christopher Fields, who you just heard. Awesome talk, really interesting. And joining him now is Susana Martinez-Conde. And Susana is the director of the Laboratory of Visual Neuroscience at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix. She's author of the international best-selling book, Sleights of Hand, and producer of the annual Best Illusion of the Year contest. And joining them also is Donald Hoffman, who is a professor of cognitive science at the University of California in Irvine. And he is the author of more than 90 scientific papers and 3 books. Nick has been with SAN since the very beginning, and he is an awesome independent filmmaker. And he's going to be moderating the panel, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you. I think we can make this a very, relaxed and comfortable chat, because some of the formal ones, yes, a very square box, but let's take this opportunity to make it a conversation among all of us. So if everyone's in agreement, I would invite people as things come along, ideas, thoughts, questions, that we make it a conversation as well, rather than get too stuck into the television interview thing. I do have a few questions just to kind of kick things off. And while I'm at it, I just really do want to acknowledge, as best I possibly can, the caliber of this panel. Everybody here, these 3 individuals have done extraordinary work in bringing our whole understanding forward at a time. It's a very exciting time in science. What we're learning about the universe, things that are being integrated, new understandings are opening up, and for scientists to stand up and take a position which is not just bound by the reductionist materialist model is still considered a radical act, largely by the academic establishment. So for somebody like Donald, who may well have solved the universe with the aid of mathematics, anybody who saw your talk this morning, I mean, I'm just honestly really, I just felt the hair go up on the back of my neck as I suddenly realized what you were explaining to us. And even though I love the Schrödinger equation, but I don't know what it is. And beautifully described. And Susanna, I had the pleasure to both be in with the interview and see some of the things you've done. And what an extraordinary thing, what extraordinary area to delve into. And I said, you get to do all the fun. She said, no, there's plenty of hard work behind the scenes, of course. And I'm afraid, Chris, I don't really know much about you, but I hope by the end of this session, in an hour and 10 minutes, I'm going to know a lot more. And I read up on some of this stuff. Hopefully, as we go through this, we'll become better acquainted. So just to kick things off, I want to just go in what sounds like a set of very simple questions. And I'm kind of poaching a little bit from Deepak. But let's take, for example, this flower over here, this beautiful arrangement of flowers over here. And we can see that in the arrangement are these lovely red flowers. So my question to begin with is, okay, I feel that I'm sitting here looking at a flower. I touch it, I can smell it. Where is the color red? Where is the velvety texture? Where is the scent? And where is the flower? Susanna. Anybody.
Well, we were talking about it a little bit in the interview this morning. The first thing I think to be clear about is that there is actually a flower, and the flower is probably there, according to my perception, but we know that perception is not always correct. So I'd say that there's a high probability that the flower is there, but not 100% certainty. from my perspective. And as to where the scent and the sight and the taste, I guess, if we try to try a bite of the flower, would be, this is all a simulation that our brain constructs. So it's in our mind.
Okay. Would you care to maybe elaborate? So perhaps if we're talking about qualia, the experience of the color.
Well, we're getting into the neural correlates of consciousness, I guess. We don't really, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? The holy grail of consciousness research, where in the brain and how in the brain are qualia generated. So, yeah, if I had the answer to that, I'd have a Nobel Prize in my hands. So I'll let my partner speculate.
Chris.
Well, I would agree with Susanna that there's certainly a bunch of stuff going on there. And given my language, I would call that physical stuff. The description of that physical stuff as a flower is coming from us. Its role in, its previous ecosystem, from the point of view of a bee, for example, it's food. From the point of view of another flower, it's a sex partner. So, in terms of asking what is that thing, we can ask that question from many different points of view. And if you ask about what are its qualities, and for us it looks red. For the bee, presumably it tastes somehow. We don't know how it tastes, but bees presumably have something analogous to taste. From a neurological standpoint, you would think they do. Who knows how it feels for flowers to have sex? I have no idea. But your question about where's the qualia in us, I would say it's not anywhere. Where's the Word document in your computer? Well, it's not anywhere. There are bits of it spread all over the disk drive, but those bits don't look anything like a document. The document's a construct of layers and layers and layers of software. So there's no such thing as saying that the document is in the computer. The document is a process that the computer could execute. So if the document's anywhere, it's in some highly abstract space of possible processes. And I think you could map what's going on in the brain into some highly abstract space of possible processes, essentially none of which we have any labels for, or any mathematical description of, or anything else along those lines. So I think Deepak is right that we need a science of qualia, but it needs to be a way, we need a language that relates some words we have in our ordinary language to extraordinarily detailed descriptions of processes that we're just beginning to be able to dream about being able to measure.
Donald, you're
Yes.
a man who obviously knows a bit about mathematics.
Yes.
Can we describe using mathematics?
Well, yes, and I would say that when we say that the flower is really there, I would say that there's two different questions. One is to say the flower is really there when I look, and another thing is to say the flower is really there when I don't look. Mm-hmm. And I would agree that the flower is really there when I look, because I really do have a flower experience, and that flower experience, like perhaps my headache, is something that I can experience. And if you said my headache wasn't really there, I would be cross with you, even though you can't experience my headache. But if you say the flower is really there when I'm not looking, then that's where I would disagree. I would say that the flower is the construction that I make when I look, and when I look away, I don't make that construction anymore, so that flower doesn't exist. You might look, and you would construct a flower, so you'll have your flower when you look at it in your perceptions. But to say that what exists independent of our perceptions in an objective reality is the flower, I think is, first, more than we know, and I think it's, if the interface theory of perception is correct, it's actually false, that a flower exists independent of our perceptions of it. I think an example of this, to make the point of what I'm trying to get at here, would be, how many people saw that cube that I showed this morning, that Necker cube, right? And how many of you saw it flip back and forth, right? You saw, so one of the cubes that you could see had the corner I labeled A was in front, right? So I'll call that cube that you saw cube A. And then the other cube had the corner B in front. And if I had asked you at any one time, how many people see cube A, probably about half of you would have raised your hand and said, say, I see cube A. And if I said, how many see cube B, the other half would have said, I see cube B. Well, then I could ask the question, who's right? Is it really cube A or is it really cube B? Well, it's clearly the wrong question. And if I say, well, what cube is up there when you don't look? Is it cube A or cube B? What is the real cube? That's also the wrong question, right? And it's the wrong question because the cube only existed as a 3D cube when you looked and you created it. There was only a flat screen up there. When you see a 3D cube, that's your constructive process. That's what I'm claiming about the flower. The flower, like the cube, exists when you construct it, and it doesn't exist otherwise. Something exists. I'm not giving up objective reality altogether. But what I'm claiming is that objective reality, whatever it is, almost surely does not resemble any of my perceptions. It's not even spatial and temporal.
Well, I think that I would agree with the concept that what we experience may or may not match reality, but I think that there's a fundamental difference between the cube and the flower. The cube and a number of other bistable and tristable and multi-stable illusions, by their very nature, they are created, and these are typically created by somebody. They're not so common in the natural world, although there is incomplete information in the world as well. But those are created for research purposes and to illustrate a point, and it is not typical of that flower that for anybody in the audience, even looking at them from the various perspectives, that their perception of it is going to be fundamentally unstable and it's going to flip back and forth. So I would say that there is a reality out there, even if we don't perceive it. I believe that after I die, there will be a reality out there for whomever else is around to perceive it. It won't be a reality to me because my perception will not outlast me, but it will be a reality nevertheless.
I have life insurance, which means that I do believe, like you, that after I'm gone, there will be something that exists. There's an objective reality that exists independent of me. The question is, does that objective reality resemble anything that I experience in my perceptual qualia? And I agree with you that the flowers are not multi-stable in my perception, and Necker cube and other things like that are multi-stable. But the point about the illusions like the Necker cube is their multi-stability reveals something about perception that's true even with our perceptions that are not multi-stable, and that is that the perception is a construction. It's just that the multi-stability sort of puts that in your face. Oh, I could see cube A, and then it flips to cube B. I must have constructed it. But then the next step is, aha, even if it's not multi-stable, I'm still constructing that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that it didn't come up during my presentation this morning, but we addressed it in the interview, that only very rarely our perception of the world is going to be in perfect correspondence with reality. Already what we know about reality and what we know about perception. And so what we end up calling illusions are the cases in which the discrepancy is highest. But most of our perception, or I would perhaps even say all of our perception, is illusory, at least to some degree. So,
right, and I agree. And what you're saying is I think, the standard view in the field. And so when I disagree with the standard view in the field, that our perceptions generally closely match reality. Illusions are cases where we see a bigger mismatch.
Actually, the standard, I believe, perception or point of view in the field is that illusions are errors of perception.
Sure.
And that is not my view at all. My view of it is that illusions, and I explained this morning that illusions give us tools to understand what the brain is doing, to understand what the brain is doing all the time. So we exaggerate the discrepancy, or we pick our examples, but we don't study illusions because they are the exception. We study illusions because they're the rule, and they're not errors. They're fundamental to how we perceive. And I believe that evolutionarily, we have arrived to these mechanisms because, in general, they give us a survival edge, even if in certain occasions that we can pick and choose, they're detrimental. But in general, they reflect brain processes that are fundamental to our survival.
I absolutely agree that the illusions actually are valuable because they show us processes that are always going on, even when we don't have illusions, and that's the power of them. I agree with that.
No, but we always do have illusions.
And I agree with that as well. Right. I mean, well, in fact, I take it to the next step and say that even space and time themselves are an illusion. That the very foundation of our whole framework of perceiving, in terms of space and time, that framework is a species-specific hallucination. That's useful. I agree with the evolutionary argument that it's useful, and that's why we have it. But it's useful despite not only not being true, but despite the fact that truth is sort of not even the relevant parameter.
Well, I think it's important that you say species-specific here. We have this word consensus reality to acknowledge that all of us perceive more or less the same thing. So we, agree that each other are human beings. We agree that this room has a certain size. So we have the good fortune as a species to have cognitive equipment that allows us to exist as a community of communicating entities and have these informal, implicit, unstated conventions like space and time that may be utterly different for even organisms that are pretty closely related to us, but that don't have analogs, direct analogs of our sensory apparatus or some of our processing apparatus. So, maybe not other mammals, but birds or cephalopods, or certainly if you start thinking about unicellular organisms or eukaryotes or bacteria, the world they see, there's probably no relevant dimensions of space and time at all. I mean, from the point of view of E. coli, there are probably many finer gradations of saltiness for them than we can possibly detect. And they understand the sense of effort, right? They're spinning their tail this way or this way or this way, and it's a lot of work. And they clearly know something about temperature, but those may be the dimensions of their world. Right? They don't have anything like the recallable memory that we have, so they probably have no time dimension at all. And given that they move sort of in a linear way and in a totally chaotic way, they probably have no sense of space either.
Something that I think it's very interesting that I think about often is how even without thinking about other species, which I think that you make a very good point, that the same physical object can elicit different kinds of perception in different nervous systems. But even as human beings, throughout our lifetime, our perception changes radically, and that even at very basic levels like space and time. And the thing is, we cannot really recall how our experience was as very young children, but we get some glimpses, like when we visit a place that we haven't seen since we were very little, and the place will look enormous and the dimensions are all distorted. Or take our experience of time, when a day used to be subjectively what seems now like a month period would take a day, and so it's almost as if we were a different species of sorts. And I think that that's another fundamental illusion that we all experience, that this continuity of the self throughout the lifetime, when in fact we are many different people, probably hundreds of different people, and maybe even different people throughout the course of a day as well.
Although that said, we have a subjective experience which, to all intents and purposes, remains a continuum. I mean, I feel this point of view, the subjective place, has always been there. But I understand what you're saying. There's this sense of, time changing, dilating, and things like that.
And just the illusion of having a same self that has continued for all of your memories, that I think is one of the most important bases of that illusion, I think, is that we have access to this memory. But the memory itself is an illusion in the sense that now in recent research from a neurophysiological standpoint, so we know, and now we can use the metaphor of the computer for this as well, that when we access memories, we're bringing them from their permanent storage to temporary storage, and then we access the memory, we re-experience this event in our life, and then we store it back. But the thing is that as we retrieve these memories, we change them. And so when we store them, it's not the same memory that we originally access. Every time that we re-experience it, every time we change it. And I think that this is actually pretty scary, because it means that those of our life-defining experiences, good or bad, these memories that life events that we tend to think about all the time, they're going to be the ones that are the most dissimilar to what actually happened.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder
That's
if
a very
it's
good
just, it
point.
would be helpful at this point. I don't want to kind of get bogged down in semantics, but when we were talking about species-specific perception, perhaps as scientists, you can just help us. Let's throw this out and see what we get. When we talk about perception, we talk about reality. What do you guys mean when you say reality? I mean, is this a meaningful word in science?
Not very.
Not really. I thought so. But I don't know, where does if it's species specific and we talk about things that we, consensus reality, but essentially it's just a bunch of processes, where's the reality in that?
Well, that's one reason that I actually prefer the word dynamics, which may not be any more meaningful than the word reality, but it's something that we have a somewhat more limited sense of, and we tend to think of dynamics as something that's in one sense simple and in another sense extraordinarily complicated and indescribably complicated. But it conveys a sense of something or other happening in a way that the word reality, at least for me, conveys a sense of something or other being or ising or something like that. And I think that we have a better chance at comprehending what we're talking about when we talk about actions or events or happenings, when we think of these things as verbs than nouns. I mean, to some extent, I'm sure that's a personal bias. But.
So, Donald, you proved reality this morning. Is that true?
Go. 5 left.
Well, I would pick up on what Chris was saying and give a concrete example that I think we talked about at lunch yesterday about. It's sometimes, in terms of perception and reality, easier to see the distinction in other species. And so I have a little example of something called the jewel beetle.
4 left long.
And the jewel beetle is this
keep
little
right into
beetle
5
in the
left.
Australian outback that's got a bumpy, glossy brown wing casing. The males fly, the females are flightless, and the males are, of course, flying around looking for females. When they find an eligible female, they alight and mate. And there's another species in the Australian outback, the Homo sapiens, where the males like full beer bottles and don't care about empties, and they toss them. And it turns out these beer bottles are bumpy, glossy, and just the right shade of brown. That the male jewel beetles go berserk. They forsake all females, they swarm on these bottles, and they had to pass laws in Australia because the species almost went extinct. So here's a species where the males had been, their perceptual systems had led them to the truth about females for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, right? You would say their perceptions are the truth about females. Well, not really. You know, apparently they have some little simple hack that we could call, look for something bumpy, glossy, and brown, the bigger the better. And that's, so their perception is not a measure of the truth, it's this little simple hack algorithm that, again, is just there to help them get through the day evolutionarily. And so the point for us is that whatever reality might be, our perceptions of space and time might be just like the bumpy, glossy, and brown of the jewel beetle. It's just there to get us through the day and not a deeper insight.
But that doesn't say much about reality. I mean, we can talk about semantics, but my underlying assumption to my work and the way that I think about these things is that there is a reality. It may be unknowable to us. It may be unknowable to us forever, although I would prefer to not think so. I would prefer to think that have an optimistic standpoint that we will be able to know reality and to know the truth at some point. Probably not for a while, but with the example with the beetle, though, I wouldn't say that proves anything about reality one way or another, or disproves. What I would say is that this is yet one more example of how neural limitations, our nervous system is limited, the beetle's nervous system is going to be limited as well, perhaps even more so. And so the beetle's nervous system is taking a shortcut. That and through evolution, perhaps millions of years, this has been a good strategy. They have been able to find mates and survive and reproduce, while at the same time saving valuable resources that they could use to save energy, find more food, you name it. But of course, then you get human beings into the equation, and this shortcut becomes not such a good idea after all.
Right. I agree completely, and I also agree with your desire to try to get a model of reality, perhaps as a process, perhaps as a dynamics. One model is that reality, whatever it is isomorphic to our perceptions. And that's the model that most people just have pre-theoretically, that I see in my experience the world of space and time and colored objects, and that's what's really there. That's the reality. And that model, I think, is just false, and so we have to cross that one off. But then there's an infinite number of other models, right? So there's other models of how my perceptions are related to reality, and the one-to-one isomorphism is just false. But that doesn't mean we can't do science. We can continue to do science. We just make models of reality, and we look at what those models imply about what we can measure and try to falsify our models. And we just cross one, like Edison trying to find the light bulb. That's not right, that's not right.
And that's a really good point. We were talking about it this morning, that what you do as a scientist is not try to find what's true, you try to find what's wrong, and then you exclude that.
That's right.
And hopefully, at some point in time, by having excluded everything else, whatever is left will be the truth. But that's more of a philosophical approach, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. We try to put out theories that are so rigorous and so precise that someone can tell us why we're precisely wrong. And then we go on to the next one, so we can find out why that's precisely wrong, until maybe we won't be wrong again.
I'd like to just pick up on 2 minutes back on these beetles and the error they're making, apparently. And talking this morning with Susanna, and we had an interview with her, and one of the things that's fascinating me, and I'd like to see what you have to think about this side. We're using a word again and again, and we have these discussions about things being hardwired. And this idea of something being hardwired means it's sort of pre-existing. It's not something that we learn along the way. It's just there. You're born with it. It's inherent to the species. And obviously these beetles are hardwired for certain stimuli, and brown bottles work. And obviously this can work with us too. We are hardwired to certain things as seeing faces, for example, this pareidolia effect that you were describing this morning, seeing faces wherever there's a sort of two dots in a line, we visualize it as a face. We don't have to try. So maybe, Susanna, we already did talk about this before. Perhaps we could just revisit it now. Could you just talk about hardwiring and what that might be from the point of view of neuroscience?
Well, this morning what we were discussing, if I remember correctly, is that yes, there are some processes, some wiring in the brain that it appears to be something that we're basically born with, and that not only that we're born with, but that it is intrinsic to our brain functioning, and that the example of two dots and a third dot underneath, even extremely young infants will show more interest to that type of configuration than the opposite configuration with the two dots are below and the one dot is above, and that will reflect the specialization that we have in terms of face processing mechanisms. But we're talking about vision, other visual processes are hardwired as well. The fact that the same gray patch will appear to be darker against a field of white than against a field of black. This has to do with very basic comparisons that the receptive fields, we call them, of neurons, the windows, the visual windows that neurons have into the world, this is how they affect local comparisons all the time to find the edges of objects and so on. So even what I think is very telling about these processes, especially in the visual domain, is...
I think we should, the way to address this is to ask the question, what are the data for a theory of reality? What are the data that any adequate theory of reality has to be able to account for? Now, certainly among these are scientific data, the data of public observation and experiments. No question that any adequate theory of reality has to be able to account for scientific data, the data of observation experiments. I call these public data. But are there any other data for a theory of reality? Another way to ask this question is there anything we know to be true about reality independently of science? So I'd like you all of you to ask yourselves that question right now. Is there anything you know to be true about reality independently of science? And I want to suggest that there is at least one thing, namely the reality of our own feelings and experiences. Our pleasures, our pains, our experiences of color, sound, smell, and taste, and so on. So this is not a scientific datum. This is not something we know about from experiments. You can't look inside someone's brain and see their feelings and experiences. Nonetheless, feelings and experiences are real. We know about them in a quite different way. You know just from your immediate awareness of your own experiences. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of your pain. So it's not a scientific datum in that sense, but it is real. Pain is real, believe it or not. And so any adequate theory of reality has to be able to account for it. So I call these private data, the immediate awareness each of us has of our own feelings and experiences. And I suggest that any adequate theory of reality has to be able to account for both public data and private data. And once you accept this, you come bang up against the ancient conundrum the philosophers call the mind-body problem, which is quite simply the challenge of how, in very general terms, to do this, how to bring together what we know about reality from science, let's call that the physical world, with the privately known reality of our own feelings and experiences. Let's call that consciousness. How to bring these two seemingly very different things, consciousness and the physical world, together in a single, unified theory of reality. That's the challenge. So, the mind-body problem. So, roughly speaking, there are three solutions. Physicalism, panpsychism, and Judaism. Well, there are more than three solutions, but I've only got 20 minutes. So remember, the challenge is how do consciousness and the physical world fit together? One possibility is physicalism, the view that it's the physical world that's fundamental, and consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain. This is the view Sean is inclined to. My own view, panpsychism, turns that on its head. So on this view, certain facts about consciousness are fundamental, and the physical facts emerge from underlying facts about consciousness. Third option, dualism, that both consciousness and the physical world are equally fundamental but distinct. Perhaps the best known proponent of this in modern times is David Chalmers. And Chalmers calls himself a naturalistic dualist. So although he thinks consciousness is not physical, he wants to bring it into the domain of science. And he does this by postulating what he calls psychophysical laws of nature, special laws of nature that connect up the mental and the physical. So even though they're very different, the mental and the physical, they interact in a law-governed way that science can discover. So, how does consciousness and the physical world connect up? Physical world is fundamental, consciousness arises from that. Consciousness is fundamental, physical world arises from that, or they're both fundamental. Now, crucially, it is not a scientific question which of these is correct. Each of these views is empirically equivalent, which means you can't distinguish between them with an experiment. So let me spend a little time spelling that out a little bit. Now, of course, experiments are absolutely crucial for dealing with consciousness. We're not going to make progress with consciousness without experiments. But the primary way in which experiments help us with the mind-body problem is in working out which kinds of physical activity in brains go along with human and animal consciousness. So although consciousness is not publicly observable, if you're dealing with a human being, you can ask them what they're feeling and experiencing, and you can scan their brain, and you can try and work out which kinds of brain activity correlate with consciousness. Now, there is no consensus here, but one contemporary candidate is the integrated information theory, which tells us that human and animal consciousness is correlated with maximal integrated information. Now, don't worry what maximal integrated information is. That is a property of complex systems that the theory gives a mathematical definition of. But let's suppose, just for the sake of discussion, that this turned out to be the true theory of how consciousness and brain activity correlate. That would be a really important, crucial bit of scientific information, but it wouldn't settle the mind-body problem. This kind of scientific data is just neutral on all those possibilities on the mind-body problem. Each one will just interpret that data in their own terms. So if you're a physical, so we're supposing that the integrated information theory turned out to be true, that consciousness goes along with maximal integrated information. If you're a physicalist, you'll say, oh, that means consciousness emerges when there's maximal integrated information. If you're a panpsychist, you'll say, well, no, that's when complex consciousness emerges from simpler forms of consciousness when there's maximal integrated information. Or if you're a David Chalmers-style dualist, you'll say, well, the psychophysical laws connect up consciousness to maximal integrated information. So all of this scientific data just leaves open these philosophical options on the mind-body problem. Okay, so if we can't distinguish between them with an experiment, how do we decide which is correct? Good question. Here's the answer. I propose we apply the following two criteria. One, simplicity. As philosophers and scientists, we don't just go for any old theory that accounts for the data. We try to go for the simplest theory, or maybe the most elegant, unified, parsimonious. So that's one criteria. Secondly, explanatory success. Does the theory meet its explanatory obligations? For example, physicalism, I would say, is obliged to explain consciousness in the terms of physical science, whilst panpsychism is obliged to explain the physical world in terms of consciousness. Right? So how well do they do on those explanatory obligations? Okay, there's the methodology, there's the criteria. Let's apply it. So firstly, in terms of simplicity, I think this gives the edge to physicalism and panpsychism over dualism. Because both physicalism and panpsychism bottom out in just one kind of stuff. Physicalism bottoms out in physical stuff. Panpsychism bottoms everything out in just consciousness stuff. Both very simple theories, whereas dualism bottoms out in two kinds of stuff, physical stuff and consciousness stuff. So, all things being equal, we can apply simplicity to rule out dualism. So that leaves, simplifying things here. So that leaves us with physicalism and panpsychism. So let's now apply the second criteria of explanatory success to each of these in turn. So starting with physicalism. So as I said, I think the central explanatory obligation of physicalism is to explain consciousness in terms of physical science. How well has it done at that explanatory task? Well, despite huge amounts of time and resources, it's got precisely nowhere. And it's not just that we don't have the final story. We haven't managed to explain a single conscious experience in terms of underlying neural firings or brain activity. The hard problem of consciousness has not softened even a little. Moreover, I think there's a very good case that philosophers have put together that this is just not a coherent project. There is precedent for ruling out a popular scientific option because it's incoherent. Galileo ruled out Aristotle's view that was believed for thousands of years, that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects, kind of common sense. And he did that just by, not with an experiment, but just showing when you really think carefully, it's just incoherent. It can't be true. I think something like this is true about physicalism, at least physicalism that aspires to explain consciousness. The problem is that there's a kind of conceptual mismatch between the mental and the physical. In that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness involves qualities. Just think about your own experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of mint, that deep red you experience as you watch the beautiful setting sun. And these qualities can't be fully articulated in the purely quantitative language of physical science. And that's important because if you wanted to explain why our experiences have the qualities they do, you'd have to be able to articulate those qualities. So suppose I have my great neuroscience theory that's going to explain why red experiences have that reddish character that you experience when you look up at that. My theory would first have to fully articulate that reddish quality in the purely quantitative language of neuroscience, and then account for it in terms of, show how it can be accounted for in terms of patterns of neural firings or what have you. If my theory can't even articulate the explanandum, then it certainly can't explain it. So I think this conceptual mismatch entails the failure of physicalist explanation. That neuroscience cannot fully explain why our experiences have the qualities they do. Now, in fact, actually, what I've just said, there's a fair amount of consensus behind it. In the recent Phil Papers survey of philosophers' opinions, 60% of philosophers across the world, Anglophone philosophers at least across the world, think that, well, zombies are logically conceivable, which roughly translates as what I'm calling conceptual mismatch here. It's not a popularity contest, but when 60% of philosophers think something, that at least gives us pause for thought. And that's why in academic philosophy, the vast majority of physicalists these days have given up, believe it or not, on this project of trying to solve the hard problem, of trying to make intelligible the emergence of consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain, in the way we've made intelligible the boiling point of water in terms of underlying chemistry. They just concede that can't be done. And instead, they just postulate, they say, well, we just postulate brute identities between the mental and the physical of a kind we find nowhere else in science. But to my mind, to
left,
give up
40.
on this explanatory project is essentially
Three
to
right,
give up on
tightens,
physicalism.
don't cut.
You know, if physicalism is true, we'd expect to be able to explain, to render intelligible the emergence of consciousness in terms of physical brain processes in the way we've rendered intelligible the boiling point of water. At least one day, if not now. And the fact that so many physicalists have just conceded that project doesn't make sense, I think is a huge cost to physicalism. And finally, just on physicalism, I don't think we should be surprised that this project doesn't do very well in terms of explanatory success. You know, I think so many people, and I guess the reason I think physicalism continues to be the most popular option, not by, you know, it's a healthy debate, it's 50% versus 30%, and then the others don't like the question or something.
5 right, don't cut, 40.
But I think it's because people, people think, look, physical science is brilliant. Look at all the stuff it's done. It's amazing. Of course, it's going to explain consciousness. But we need to explain, well, what is it been so good at?
3 right, tightens,
and I think, you know, what physical science has been good at is accounting for publicly observable behavior. You know, you have a complex system. You account for its behavior by postulating a mechanism, ultimately postulating fundamental laws of physics. That's what physics does well. But when we're explaining consciousness, it's a totally different explanatory project. We're not trying to explain this publicly observable behavior. We're trying to explain these invisible qualities that fill our experience that are not publicly observable but are known by each of us privately. It's just a totally different explanatory project. It's like saying telescopes have been really good in astronomy. Probably they'll be really good in pure math. It's just like a different thing. Okay, so in terms of explanatory success, physicalism does really badly. What about panpsychism? In terms of explanatory success? Well, the difference could not be starker.
6 right.
In terms of its central explanatory task, how do we account for the physical reality in terms of consciousness? We have already worked out how to do this. We know it can be done. And this is where we go back to the very important work from the 1920s by Bertrand Russell. I think we should think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness. I think he sort of solved all the mysteries. This got forgotten about for a long time for various historical reasons. Recently been rediscovered and causing a revival of interest in panpsychism in academic philosophy departments. So the base, I'll just give you the basic idea of this in the remaining time. So what Russell was doing in the 1920s was thinking very hard about the fact that our fundamental science is purely mathematical, which is something we kind of take for granted, but was a radical innovation in the scientific revolution to say, from now on, our basic science is just going to be pure math.
And
maths,
2 left tightens, 40.
British say. I always translate for American audience.
And 5 right, long.
It's not fair.
And 6 left. Into 4 left, into.
But what does it mean? So it's very useful if you're a practicing scientist to have mathematics. You can get very precise predictions. What does it mean as a philosopher interested in the fundamental nature of reality? That our fundamental science is just a load of equations. Well, what Russell realized what it means is our fundamental science, namely physics, isn't telling us very much at all about fundamental reality. It's merely describing its mathematical structure. And so, as far as physics is concerned, fundamental reality could turn out to be anything. The only constraint it imposes is the mathematical structure. So, fundamental reality could be anything. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to be able to get physics out of that. So the contemporary Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychist exploits this to make sense of their position. So the idea that at the fundamental level of reality, we have networks of very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures.
And 2 left.
And then the thought is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics.
And 3
so you
left.
get physics out of underlying facts about consciousness.
6 right.
So you can't get consciousness out of physics, but you can get physics out of consciousness. We know, I would say, that can be done.
4 left. 40.
So the poetic way of putting it, the final page of A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking said, Even a final theory of
Two
physics
left,
would be just a
tightens,
set of rules and
and
equations
two right,
and wouldn't
long.
tell us what breathes fire into the equations
two
and
left.
makes a universe for them to describe.
6
So
right.
for the panpsychist, it's
Into, hairpin
consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So the difference couldn't be starker.
Two right, long.
Physicalism, we've never got anywhere with that project.
And
It's
three left,
arguably
long.
good
Tightens
case that
late.
it's incoherent,
Into, hairpin right.
which is to be expected, I would suggest, given what it's been good at. Panpsychism, we've solved
Four
all the
right,
mysteries.
tightens
We
three,
know how
late.
to do this.
Into, two
So,
left tightens,
what's
50.
the verdict? Here's my book, gratuitous
Three
advert
left
of my book,
and
Galileo's
four
Error,
right.
which solves all the mysteries. So
five
let's
left,
compare all the
break,
three
into
options
two
on
right.
these criteria. In terms of simplicity,
And two left
panpsychism
tightens,
is superior
into
to
two
dualism.
right,
In terms
40.
of explanatory success, panpsychism is superior to physicalism. Clear verdict, panpsychism
right.
is the best
Into
solution
two
to the
right,
mind-body
tightens.
problem. Feels a bit weird, but so what? It
Five
does the
right.
job. So in conclusion,
Into, three
perfect
left.
timing. Proud of myself, sorry.
Three left.
I would say
And
the mind-body
three right.
problem is a philosophical,
And
not a
six
scientific
left,
challenge.
40.
In terms of simplicity and explanatory
Five
success,
left and
panpsychism
five
looks
right.
to be the best
Into
solution to
two
this
left
philosophical
long,
challenge.
opens
Therefore,
70.
probably consciousness is fundamental. Thank you.
Four left and four right, short, 60. Five left. Caution, brake, three right, into
All right,
hairpin
is my
left, tightens late.
microphone on? Is that working? So there are
Five right,
people out
into
there,
four left,
as you've just seen, who think that
and five right,
the
100.
difficulties we have in understanding consciousness should lead
Caution,
us
six left,
to
brake, into
dramatically
hairpin
alter
right,
our
tightens
best
late.
picture of physical reality.
Five left,
I
90.
think this is a bad idea. And you know, look, maybe it's right. It's certainly possibly right. But just a priori,
Five left,
our
into four
understanding
right,
of physical reality is incredibly
into
good.
three left, tightens.
Individuals might lack a
And
perfect
four
understanding
right,
of physical
80.
reality, but as a species, we know an awful lot about it. Because it's
Brake,
very
two right,
simple.
long.
The rules are remarkably graspable, whereas consciousness would
Six
be
left,
your
40.
first suggestion for something we don't yet understand. It's an emergent phenomenon from 86 billion neurons and the many, many more connections between them. Of course, that's hard to understand. Our lack of perfect understanding about that should not
Four
lead
left.
us to question our
Into
best picture
two
of
right,
physical
and
reality.
three left.
It's like you're doing a math
And
homework,
five right, into
handing
four
your math
left.
homework, and the professor says,
Into
you know, I
two
think
right.
there's a mathematical mistake
And
here between
three
line
left,
3 and line
tightens two,
4.
late.
And you say, well,
Four
have you
right,
thought about
short,
the possibility
150.
that the axiomatic foundations of arithmetic are not as solid as you thought they were? Maybe,
Hairpin left.
but I do not recommend that as a strategy for trying to improve your grade.
Four
This
right,
argument
70.
goes way back, obviously, right? Here's Rene Descartes, the dualist,
Six
who
right.
thought that
Brake,
mind and
four
body
left,
were
into
completely
hairpin
separate
right.
things. And here is his nemesis, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. He
Four
sent
left,
the manuscript
60.
to Princess Elizabeth. He just wanted money. What he got instead was correspondence
Three left,
saying,
opens,
this makes
60.
no sense. Why?
Three right,
Because you're
tightens
saying that the
two,
mind
late.
is completely immaterial, doesn't even have a location in space. So tell me how it interacts with the body. It's not even located anywhere. How is it that my mind, which I think makes decisions and gives my body instructions, where does that interaction happen? And Descartes made an attempt. He drew pictures of the pineal gland. You know, maybe that was the radio receiver in the
left
brain that
tightens,
gets
50.
messages from the mind. No one even back then was convinced by this. And
Two
of
right,
course, so
tightens,
now,
40.
people who want the mind to be something other than physical have much more sophisticated and nuanced and delicate versions of this kind of approach that is not purely physical. But we have another option now that works much better, namely physicalism. And the trick in physicalism to make sense of consciousness is what is called weak emergence. The idea is that the world appears to us in layers or levels. There are multiple vocabularies, multiple ways of describing the world that work equally well, even though they're describing different levels of precision and coarse graining. So you have the classic example of a successful application of this comes from the 19th century and the success of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. We say we have a box of gas, there's some molecules in it. You can speak the language of the molecules. You can use the vocabulary of the microscopic level. And at that level, the words you use are atoms and forces and momenta and collisions, and you can describe what happens inside the box. There's another way of talking about the gas in the box, what you might call the emergent level, where you talk a completely different vocabulary of gases with volume and pressure and temperature and things like that. And these two ways of talking are describing the same thing. They're completely compatible with each other. They're not in conflict in any way. In this very simple example, you could even derive the emergent description from the microscopic one, but what's important is there is some relationship between them. Even if you can't derive it mathematically, maybe you discover it empirically, that's fine. The thing is, you're not putting anything new in at the emergent level. You're just saying that's a different way of talking about the same stuff that's going on at the micro level. So a physicalist is going to say the same thing about consciousness. They're going to say there's a very fundamental level where we're all made of quantum fields and there's Hamiltonians, observables, and things like that. But we can also step back a little bit and talk about the biological level, where there are in our brains neurons and there's chemistry going on. There's connections and signals that go across synapses. That's another perfectly valid way of talking, completely compatible with the underlying quantum field theory description. And then there's a human scale way of talking, where there are agents, right? People with free will. They behave in certain ways, and they also have consciousness. They have impressions, they experience the redness of red, and that entire vocabulary features relationships between these different components. When I'm conscious of the red of the stop sign, I will stop, and so forth. And they are completely compatible with the underlying description. It's very important in this whole way of thinking that you not get yourself confused by switching levels in midstream, by saying, you know, I felt pain because the Hamiltonian of the universe had certain operators in it, right? The individual vocabularies are supposed to be up to the task on their own level. You ask a question one level, you answer it in that one level, and you will not get into trouble. And we have lots of evidence that this basic strategy is on the right track, but let me be very, very quick to admit, I do not know how consciousness works. Whenever I'm up on stages talking about consciousness, number one, it is never my idea. And number two, people always say, why are you up there doing that? You don't know anything about consciousness. So let me reiterate that I don't know anything about consciousness, but I know something about the fundamental nature of reality. So much so that I'm confident that whatever the explanation of consciousness is going to be, someday it will be within that framework. And part of that is because it's not like we're flailing around with nothing to do. If physicalism is true, if that picture I just mapped out for you is on the right track, it's very clear what to do. We have to map out what happens physically in the brain and in the body. Separately, we can map out what happens mentally. We have experiences, we react to them in certain ways, and then we relate them to each other. This is a very successful program so far. This weird-looking picture on the top right is actually a picture of my head. I was sitting there in the MEG, the magnetoencephalograph, and I was being given stimuli, and I was thinking thoughts, and my thoughts were creating little magnetic fields. And these are the observed magnetic fields created by my thoughts, evidence that there are thoughts in my brain, if nothing else. But the point is, this is a very, very primitive example of showing that relationship between a thought you have in your brain and the lower level way of talking about exactly the same thing, the electrochemical processes in the brain. And so this whole task of coming up with a way to describe consciousness in these physical terms, we haven't completed it yet or anything like it, but we're very much on the way, and there's plenty of proposals along those directions. It is an active and very promising research program. Somehow, not everyone agrees. So there is what I like to call the satisfaction gap, which I think is the real reason people don't like this physicalist approach, because they just don't like the physicalist approach. They don't quite think it scratches the itches that they have. They are not satisfied that this is answering the questions that they are asking. So an alternative that you might want to consider, as Philip just told us, is panpsychism. The idea that consciousness is everywhere. Here's an image of a conscious rock, and mentality is ubiquitous and underlies everything. Okay, let's consider this. So there's various arguments that have been put forward in favor of this. I want to hit on some of the classics because I love the classic arguments against physicalism, because if you think about them carefully, they all end up being arguments for physicalism. So here is Mary the color scientist, known as the knowledge argument. The idea is philosophers, bless their hearts, will do terrible torture to their thought experiment subjects, but their thought experiments, they don't need to get IRB approval. So Mary the color scientist is locked in a room with no colors in it, and she's taught all the physical facts about the universe. So she's never seen the color red, but she knows every physical fact about red. And then you imagine they finally let her out, and she can see the color red. She experiences it, and we think that she is learning something new. Therefore, the argument goes, there is some kind of knowledge other than the physical facts, right? She knew all the physical facts, but there was something she didn't know, what it was like to experience the color red. Therefore, what its likeness is not physical. It's something called qualia or something like that. Before you get too impressed with this argument, I will ask you to contemplate the phrase, Mary knows every physical fact about the color red. Are you 100% certain that you completely understand what that phrase means? It is very common in this form of argumentation that you use natural language words, and maybe they're a little fuzzy around the edges about what exactly is being conveyed, and you can kind of trick yourself into a conclusion that is not quite warranted. The right way to analyze this, if you think this is an argument against physicalism, is to say, is there a physicalist explanation for what happens in the thought experiment? And when you put it that way, the answer is of course there is. It's not even like especially hard. When Mary is learning about color in her black and white room, certain neurons are firing in her brain. When she sees red, different neurons are firing, or in a different pattern they're firing. There are red photons impinging on her retina. That's it. That's the entire explanation. There's absolutely nothing incompatible about physicalism to say that what happens in her brain is different when she sees the color red versus when she reads about the color red in a black and white textbook. It is not in any sense a challenge to the physicalist understanding. It gets worse for the anti-physicalists because, like I said at the beginning, we know a lot about the physical underpinnings of the natural world. And here I need to be super duper delicate because this is exactly where there's a very strong impulse to not understand what I'm saying and to misconstrue it. So I'm going to try to be very careful. I'm not saying that physics is done. I'm not saying we understand everything. I'm not saying we are close to understanding everything and tomorrow we'll figure it all out. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm saying there are some things that we understand. And it happens to be that included in the things we understand are all of the physical things going on in this room right now that are relevant to our biology and our thinking and so forth. You and I are made of atoms. And those atoms are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. There are quarks and gluons in the protons and neutrons. There are forces holding them together, the strong force inside the protons and neutrons, the weak force that can change a neutron into a proton, the electromagnetic force that binds electrons to the nucleus. There's a background Higgs field that gives masses to these particles. And then there's gravity that pulls everything together. We even have an equation that you can fit on a t-shirt. I know this because you can buy the t-shirt on my website. I have the t-shirt, I didn't wear it. I'm not as good a salesperson as Philip is, otherwise I would have shown you the t-shirt. You can look it up. So the point is that this is called the core theory. Sometimes you get the impression that we understand particle physics but not gravity. It's all there, gravity included in the core theory. And this theory is successful enough to explain every experiment that we've ever done in any laboratory here on Earth. That's pretty good. But it's better even than that. It's not just that we haven't yet seen anything that is in conflict with the core theory. It's that we know.
Welcome to Meany Hall. Please take a moment to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. The use of cameras and recording devices is not permitted. Thank you.
This is our 40th anniversary year for the Graduate Opportunities Minority Achievement Program, and I want to acknowledge the work of this office in the graduate school, and especially the work of Associate Dean Juan Guerra, who has led for 5 years our efforts and our goals to recruit and retain the very best among our students. GOMAP supports important outreach programs, such as hosting tonight's special guests, future UW scientists, Seattle's very own Cleveland High School students. Where are you? Stand up, stand up, stand up. They're the Eagles, right? Study hard. Call me in about 5 years. We also have students here from Franklin High School, the Quakers. Where is... Yeah, okay, I would like to acknowledge the two generous endowments that made this evening's events possible. Established in 1961 and 1990, respectively, the Jesse and John Dans and the Mary Ann and John Mangles endowments allow the University of Washington to share many talented scholars with our community. And finally, I wish to express sincere thanks to all of you who've joined us here tonight, both here in Meany Hall and those of you online at uwtv.org. Dr. Tyson will take questions after his talk, and you can text him at 25827, 25827. To ensure that we get it right, please begin your question with the word UW grad. Again, that's 25827 UW grad. Our speaker tonight, Neil deGrasse Tyson, will be introduced by UW astronomy graduate student Aoma Shields.
Good evening, and thank you, Jerry. As the dean said, my name is Aoma Shields, and I am a second-year doctoral student in the astronomy department and the astrobiology program here at the University of Washington. I'm grateful to the Graduate Opportunities and Minority Achievement Program and to the Graduate School for the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. 3 years ago, I emailed a NASA administrator who I didn't even know and asked her for guidance. I'd had a taste of science TV show hosting and wanted more of it. She wrote back promptly, "You should meet my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'll introduce you. And by the way, he loves the movie Happy Feet. So you can't go wrong mentioning that." Dr. Tyson told me that a career in astronomy, be it research or science television, was self-limiting without a PhD. For his guidance and encouragement, I am forever grateful. Neil deGrasse Tyson was born and raised in New York City and graduated from the Bronx High School of Science. He earned his BA in physics from Harvard and his PhD in astrophysics from Columbia. Dr. Tyson has served on presidentially appointed commissions and NASA's Advisory Council to study the future and development of the U.S. space program. Among Tyson's 9 books is his memoir, The Sky is Not the Limit, Adventures of an Urban Astrophysicist, and Origins, 14 Billion Years of Cosmic Evolution, which was made into a 4-part miniseries that Tyson hosted. Tyson is currently on-camera host of PBS Nova's spin-off program, Nova Science Now. Tyson's latest 2 books are Death by Black Hole and Other Cosmic Quandaries, which was a New York Times bestseller, and The Pluto Files, The Rise and Fall of America's Favorite Planet. Tyson is the recipient of 9 honorary doctorates and the NASA Distinguished Public Service Medal. The International Astronomical Union celebrated his contributions to the public appreciation of the cosmos in their official naming of asteroid 13123 Tyson. Tyson is the first occupant of the Frederick P. Rose Directorship of the Hayden Planetarium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Good evening. Thanks for that warm welcome. Normally you save that for the end so that I earn it, okay? I just want to earn that from you. The sun came out today. I thought that was kind of interesting. In fact, I might tweet that right now, if I may. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay? So I have a tweet ready to go there. Let's see. In Seattle now, the sun came out today and people reacted joyously. Must be a rare event. Okay. 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 So we'll check back in on that later, why don't we? And let's get back to, am I there? Now, what I'm really going to do, this is really a talk on the musings of an astrophysicist. That's really what's going on here. This lecture might not even be coherent, because I'm just spilling out perspectives on things, just scattering them into the wind for you to receive, okay? So there's a little bit of everything tonight. I hope you don't mind. Now, often talks like this are just sort of loosely veiled commercials for some book somebody's going to sell. But this was no exception to that. No, but actually, no, I don't like giving book talks because you can just read the book. If I'm there in person, I might as well talk about something you can't get from a book. So some of what I'll be talking about is in books, but the collection of it all together, you're not getting anywhere except here and now. So let's just start. So we're going to do some science up front, but then we're going to take you to new places, all right? In the search for life, what we're doing is we're trying to find the water. And we know there's water on Earth, and there's life everywhere on Earth where there's water. There's life, even the Dead Sea. The fact that it's called the Dead Sea is an example of what you say when you don't have a microscope. Okay, so this is just how that was. Mars, there are microbes doing just fine in the Dead Sea. Mars, Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, exoplanets. So our search for life is driven by the search for water. Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter where we're pretty sure there's an ocean, a liquid ocean of water beneath a frozen surface. So one day I want to go ice fishing on Europa, cut a hole, check out, see what swims up to the camera lens. You know what I like about Europa? Suppose we do find life. Then what do you call it? Call it Europeans, you see? that's what else would you call it? Let's go to Mars. We've seen Mars before. There's a nice shot of Mars. Can people hear me up on the top? Up in the cheap seats up there? You guys okay? You're all up there? Okay. Mars. Mars is intriguing because it rotates once in about 24 hours. It's tipped on its axis, so it has seasons. It's got polar ice caps. It gets everybody excited, especially this fellow, looking quite tweedy there. Percival Lowell, a wealthy New Englander, who was wealthy enough to just sort of build his own observatory, and he called it the Lowell Observatory, yeah. put it in Arizona, and he was like really liked Mars, and he was pretty sure life was thriving on Mars. So he wrote several books. This was his first. And you look in these books and you find diagrams like this. And he called these canals, which was a mistranslation of canales in Italian, which meant channels. But he was wealthy, but he didn't know Italian. And so he thought the people who thought they saw channels, he thought they meant canals. And if it's a canal, it means it's artificially made. So this is what he saw when he looked through his telescope that he made and put in his observatory. Now, we know that none of these canals are there, and there aren't these cities. He was imagining life forms were going extinct, and they would channel water from the poles into the cities, and it was catching them right at the end of their civilization. So this is not the first crazy thing he did. But anyway, in modern times, we actually go there. Yeah, so there we've got one of the rovers. We went there before the rovers. You might know that. We went there back in the 70s. Two Viking, they were called Vikings, one landed, one orbited. And the orbiter took this photo. That's a good one. Ooh, oh, ooh, ooh. Yeah, that's better music here. The face on Mars. Da, 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 da. So everybody got excited. Well, sorry, not everybody. Those people who were sure that life on Mars had a simian face, okay? I mean, think about it. Most life on Earth does not have a simian face. Most life on Earth doesn't have a face, all right? So life with which we have DNA in common. All life on Earth has DNA in common. Now you're going to go to another planet and it has a face. The only things on Earth that have faces are like vertebrates have faces. That's a vertebrate face. So you want to say that there are vertebrates on Mars and they're simian in their biology. Well, there's only one thing that looks like a face, no matter the camera angle. And what is that? A face, yes. So we go back at another time, and this is what it is at another time with higher resolution. It looks less like a face. You can kind of see how it might have been. Now, all the Mars fanatics said, oh, the Martians figured out we were looking at them, and they quickly covered up the monument. Then you go back again, and it's like even less like a face. So the Martians have continued to cover this up, apparently. So more on that later. But in fact, I do have the first evidence from the rovers. This photo, in fact, has been kept from the public till I have special connections to NASA, as you heard in the introduction. So this one was the first image taken by the rovers, and it's been suppressed by NASA ever since. Right. So I thought I'd share it with you guys because, like, you know, you're my people tonight here. By the way, if you're looking on Mars for faces, why not look for other things that are familiar? You know, you only see that as a face because we have a face. And familiar things are what you pick out, even if they're not really there, right? When you look up in the clouds, you don't say, oh, I see a lobster. No. Has anyone ever said they see a lobster? No, you say, I see Abe Lincoln or George Washington. You're looking at sort of familiar iconography of our culture. And so let's find some more familiar iconography in the Martian terrain. There's the Valentine crater. There you go. We got one of those. How about the smiley face crater, right? So if you look hard enough, you can find stuff and call it whatever you want. So, but Mars, one thing is certain. It's long suspected, but recently confirmed, that water, while not on the Martian surface, is beneath the surface and not very far beneath. This is a crater about the size of this stage that was freshly left in the photo on the left side of the image here. And if there's water beneath the surface and an impactor comes and an asteroid hits and it makes a crater, that crater is, like I said, about the size of this stage, it will lay bare any water that happened to be beneath the surface. That water would melt on impact and then instantly freeze, and then there you get it, right there. You see the frozen sort of surface area there. Now you might say, well, suppose that's just chalk or some white rock. maybe it's not really water. Well, you come back a few weeks later and it's basically evaporated. The official word for that would be to sublime, if you're into accurate chemistry vernacular. And so the point here is the evidence that water is beneath the surface remains manifest in many ways. And here's one where you see rivulets and a flood puddle over to the side. I mean, this is just, they're meandering riverbeds and river deltas, all of the telltale signs of water carvings that you fly over when you cross the Midwest in a plane. You see that on Mars. So definitely water's there. So water's good because maybe there was once life, but also water gives you energy. Did you know that the orange tank of the space shuttle has 2 tanks within it, one twice as large as the other? The big one contains hydrogen, the little one contains oxygen. You bring them together, the exhaust of that tank is H2O, otherwise known as water. And that is the very simple chemical formula for what's going on at the bottom, at the business end of the space shuttle. Okay? Now, it's also going up from the 2 solid rocket boosters on the left, but the main tank is essentially non-polluting because its exhaust is steam. The other 2 tanks, that's a different story. Let's go to Europa. This is the surface of Europa. This looks a little weird, but if you take pictures of the ice flows in the northern Atlantic, whatever ice flows remain, and you see them freeze, break, and refreeze, it looks exactly like this. There are places where you see cracks had developed and froze over again, interfering with previous places where tracks had gone through. So it's a rather busy place. It's been suggested that if you go to Europa, you don't actually have to dig through the ice. It might be a kilometer thick. You don't have to dig through because any place the ice cracked, water seeps up and then freezes again. So if there are any fishes down there, maybe a fish came up and froze, so there's like a freezer ready for you to just have your barbecue right there. You just park your ship right near one of these ravines, and right in the middle, that would be freshly frozen material from way down below. So maybe you don't have to. Other things we're looking for are exoplanets. Gliese 581G is an exoplanet, one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. In fact, this morning, if you listen to the radio interview that I had, I recommended an app for your phone, your smartphone. And it's called Exoplanets. Go check it out. And it is up to the minute listing of every exoplanet that's been discovered in the catalog. You can see the orbit, whether it is a Goldilocks planet or not. And Goldilocks, that's pretty simple. It means if you're too close, your water evaporates. Too close to the host star, too far away, it freezes. You want to be just right, like Goldilocks. And I was always disturbed by the Goldilocks story because, you know, if you're the Bears and you come home and like, there's Goldilocks, done ate your porridge, done sleeping in your bed, and I think the Bears would have just simply eaten her, you see? That would have been, so the lesson would have been much more profound. Bears, those bears would eat people, see? So that's what I'm thinking. So you can find the orb, so it's G right there at the bottom, and for that star, that G is in the Goldilocks zone.